Soul of the Fire by Terry Goodkind. Continuing on page 435. Bertrand held up a hand.
The Imperial Order has offered to purchase our goods at prices far above those we now receive.
They applauded and whistled.
Lord Rahl would steal it from you. That is your choice, good people. To listen to the lies of this vile magician from the distant Dahara, who would trick you into giving away your rights, who would use our land to propagate his things of vile magic to press on with a needless war, who would let your children starve or die from the harmful effects of his mad spells, or to sell what you grow and produce to the Imperial Order and enrich your families as never before.
Now the crowd was truly worked up. People with fresh goodwill toward their new sovereign were for the first time hearing solid reasons to reject Lord Rahl. More than that, solid reason to fear him. But best of all, solid reasons to hate him. Dalton was crossing some items from the list in his hand when they saw they weren't as effective and circling others that received the biggest reactions. As he and Bertrand knew it would, the word children provoked the biggest reaction, inciting a near riot at the terrible things about to happen to them. The mere mention of the word children caused reason to evaporate from people's heads. War, too, had the effect they had expected. People were terrified to learn it was Lord Rahl pressing the war, and that there was no need for it. People would want peace at any cost. When they discovered the cost, they would pay. It would be too late for them to do otherwise.
We must get past this, my people. Put it in the past, and get on with the business of Anderith. We have much work to do. Now is not the time to give up all we have accomplished to become a slave state to this magician from afar, a man obsessed with wealth and power, a man who only wants to drag us all into his foolish war. There could be peace if he would only give peace a chance, but he won't. I know such a man would cast aside our traditions and religion, leaving you without a sovereign, but I fear for you, not myself. I have so much yet to do. I have so much love to give to the people of Anderith. I have been blessed, and I have so much to give back to the community. I beg of you as proud people of Anderith all, to show your contempt for this sly demon from Dahara. Show him you see his wicked ways. The Creator himself, through me, demands you stand up to Lord Rahl when you vote your conscience by putting an X through his evil, X through his tricks, X through his lies, X through his tyranny, X through him and the Mother Confessor, too. The square roared. The buildings around shook with it as it went on and on. Bertrand held his arms up in front of himself, crossing them to make a big X everyone could see as they cheered him. Hildemara at his side applauded as she fixed him with her customary public adoring gaze. When the crowd finally quieted as he raised a silencing hand, Bertrand held the hand out to his wife, introducing her to the people. They cheered for her almost as long as for him. Hildemara, pleased beyond measure with her new role, spread her hands for quiet. She got it almost instantly. Good people of Anderith, I cannot tell you how proud I am to be the wife of this great man.
She was drowned out by the roaring cheer. Her outstretched arms finally succeeded in again bringing silence.
I cannot tell you how I've watched as my husband has worked his heart out for the people of Anderith. Caring not for recognition, unnoticed, he has labored tirelessly for the people, without regard even to his own rest or nourishment. When I would ask him to rest, he would say to me, Hildemara, as long as there are hungry children, I cannot rest.
As the crowd again went wild, Dalton had to turn away to take a sip of wine. Teresa clutched his arm.
Dalton, she whispered, the Creator has answered our prayers to deliver us, Bertrand Chambord, to be sovereign.
He almost laughed, but saw the awe in her eyes as she looked at the man. Dalton sighed to himself. It was not the Creator who delivered them, Bertrand, but Dalton himself. Tess, wipe your eyes. The best is yet to come. Hildemara went on.
And for the sake of those children, I ask that every one of you reject the hate and division Lord Rahl would peddle to our people. Reject the Mother Confessor, too, for what does she know of common people? She is a woman born into advantage, born into wealth. What does she know of hard work? Show her that her birthright of dominance is at an end. Show her we will not willingly submit to her hateful treatment of poor working people. Show her we reject her privileged life. X through the Mother Confessor and her pompous demands of people she doesn't even know. I say the Lord Ralph and the Mother Confessor have enough wealth. Don't give them yours, too. They've no right to it."
Dalton yawned and rubbed his eyes as the cheering turned to chanting of the name Chanbur. He couldn't remember sleeping. He'd had to twist the arm of one of the directors to make it unanimous. Such unanimity inferred divine intervention on behalf of the chosen sovereign and served to strengthen his mandate. When at last Bertrand again stepped up and addressed the crowd, Dalton was only half listening, until he heard his name mentioned.
"This is why, among other reasons too numerous to mention, I have personally involved myself in the selection process. It is with special pride I introduce to you the new Minister of Culture, a man who will protect and serve as well as any who have gone before him."
Bertrand held out his hand.
"Dalton Campbell."
Beside him, Teresa fell to her knees, bowing her head to Bertrand.
"Oh, Sovereign, your greatness, thank you for recognizing my husband. Bless you for what you have done for him."
Rather than feeling proud of the appointment, Dalton felt a bit let down. Teresa knew the work he put into getting where he had gotten, but now she ascribed it all to the greatness of Bertrand Chanbur. Such was the power of the sovereign's word. As he looked out over the crowd of cheering people and thought about the words he would say to back Bertrand and Hildemara, he guessed it was just as well, for the people too would be just as swayed by the sovereign's stand on the coming vote. But there was yet more to come. Dalton had yet to unleash the final element. The smell, like a prisoner rushing to escape, hit him full on as the door was dragged open. It was too dark to see. Dalton snapped his fingers, and the big Ander guards yanked the torches from the rusty brackets and brought them along. "Are you sure he's still alive?" Dalton asked. "Do you ever check?"
"He's alive, Minister."
Dalton was momentarily confused, and then staggered by the title. Whenever someone addressed him by the title, it took a split second to realize they meant him. Just the sound of it, Minister of Culture Dalton Campbell, left him reeling. The guard held out the torch.
"Over here, Minister Campbell."
Dalton stepped over men so filthy they looked nearly invisible against the greasy black floor. Fetid water ran through a depression in the center of the blackened brick. Where it came into the room, it provided drinking water, such as it was. Where it went out, it was a latrine. The walls, the floor, the men were alive with vermin. At the far side of the room, across the foul water, a small barred window, about head height and too small for a man to crawl through, opened onto an alley. If family or friends cared if the prisoners lived, they could come to the alley and feed them. Because the men's arms and feet were secured in wooden blocks to restrain them, they couldn't fight one another for food. They could do little more than lie on the floor. They couldn't walk because of the blocks. At best, they could hop a short distance. If they could straighten enough, they could put their mouth up near the window and receive food. If no one fed them, they died. All the prisoners were naked. The torchlight reflected off greasy black bodies, and he saw that one of the prisoners was a skinny old woman without teeth. Dalton wasn't even sure some of the men were alive. They showed no reaction to the men stepping over them. "I'm surprised he's alive," Dalton said to the guard.
"He has those who believe in him still. They come every day and feed him. He speaks to them through the window after they feed him. They sit and listen to him ramble on, as if what he had to say were important."
Dalton had no idea the man still had his followers. It was a bonus. With ready followers, it would take little time to have the movement underway. A guard dipped a torch to point.
"There he is, Minister Campbell. That's the fellow."
The guard kicked the man lying on his side. The head turned their way. Not fast, not slow, but deliberate. Rather than the cowed look Dalton expected, one fiery eye glared up. "Seren Rajak?" "That's right," the man growled. "What do you want?" Dalton squatted down beside the man. He had to make a second attempt at drawing a breath. The stench was overpowering. "I've just been appointed Minister of Culture, Master Rajak. Only today. As my first act, I've come to right the injustice done you." Dalton saw then that the man was missing an eye. He had a badly healed, sunken scar where it had once been. "Injustice. The world is full of injustice. Magic is loose to harm people. Magic has put me here. But I've not given in to it. No, sir, I've not. I'll never give in to the evil of magic. I gladly gave an eye in the cause. Lost it to a witch. If you expect me to renounce my holy war against the vile purveyors of magic, you can just leave me here. Leave me, do you hear? Leave me. I'll never give in to them." Dalton backed away a little as the man floundered wildly on the floor, yanking at restraints that even someone who was only half crazy could see would never surrender their grip to his trying. He thrashed until fresh blood colored his wrists. "I'll not renounce the struggle against magic. Do you hear? I'll not give in to those who inflict magic on those of us who worship the Creator." Dalton put a restraining hand on the man's greasy shoulder. "You misunderstand, sir. Magic is doing great damage to our land. People are dying from fires and drowning. People, for no reason, are leaping off buildings and bridges. Witches. That is what we fear. Witches cursing people. If you fools would only listen. I tried to warn you. I tried to help. I tried to rid the land of them. That's why I'm here, Seren. I believe you. We need your help. I've come to release you and beg you help us." The white of the man's one eye as he stared up was a beacon in the inky night of filth. "Praise the Creator," he whispered. At last, I've been called to do his work." Chapter 60. Richard was stunned by the sight. The wide thoroughfare was packed with people, nearly all carrying candles, a glowing flood of faces washing up Fairfield's broad main avenue. They flowed around the trees and benches in the center between the two sides of the road, making them look like treed islands. It was just turning dark. The afterglow at the horizon in the western sky, behind the peaks of distant mountains, showing through a thin gap in the gathering clouds, was a deep purple with a pink blush. Overhead, leaden clouds had been gathering all afternoon. The deep rumble of sporadic thunder could be heard in the distance. The humid air smelled damp, while at the same time dust churned up by the hooves of the horses rose to choke the air. Occasionally there fell an errant drop of rain, fat and ripe with the promise of more to follow. The Haran soldiers surrounded Richard and Kalen and Du Shailu in a ring of steel. The mounted men all around them reminded Richard of a boat floating in the sea of faces. The soldiers skillfully refused to give way without looking like they were forcing people aside. The people ignored them. Their attention seemed to be on getting where they were going, or maybe it was just too dark for the people to recognize them, thinking they were part of the Anderith army. The Bakatal Mana blade masters had vanished. They did that sometimes. Richard knew they were simply taking up strategic positions in case of trouble. Du Shailu yawned. It was the end of a long day of traveling that saw them finally returning to Fairfield. Richard didn't like the looks of what he saw, and led everyone with him off the main avenue packed with people to a deserted street not far from the main city square. In the gathering gloom he dismounted. He wanted to get a closer look, but didn't want people to see him there with all the soldiers. Good as his men were, they were no match for the tens of thousands of people in the streets. A colony of tiny ants, after all, could overpower a lone insect many times their size. Richard left most of the men behind to wait and watch the horses, while he took Kalen and a few men with him to see what was happening. Du Shailu didn't ask if she could come along, she simply did. Jian, having scouted the area to his satisfaction and found it reasonably safe, joined them. In the shadows of two-story buildings to either side of a north-south street opening onto the square, they watched unnoticed. A masonry platform with a squat stone railing across the front sat at the head of the square. From it, public announcements were made. Before they went away, Richard had spoken there to interested, earnest people. Richard and Kalen had come into Fairfield on their way back, intending to speak again at the square before they went on to the estate. It was urgent to start the tedious task of combing through all the books either by or about Joseph Ander, searching for a key to stopping the chimes, but Richard had wanted to reinforce the positive things he had told these people before. In the last few days, the chimes had grown worse. They seemed to be everywhere. Richard and Kalin had been able to stop some of their own men overcome with the irresistible call of death just before they leaped into fire or slipped into water. They hadn't been in time for others. None of them had been getting much sleep. The gathered multitude started chanting, "No more war, no more war, no more war." It was a dull drone, deep and insistent, like the quaking of the distant thunder. Richard thought it a good sentiment, one he wholeheartedly embraced. But he was disturbed by the anger in people's eyes and the tone in their voices as they chanted it. It went on for a time, like thunder booming in from the plains, building, growing. A man near the platform held up his young girl on his shoulders for the people to see. "She has something to say! Let us speak! Please! Hear my child!" The crowd called out encouragement. The girl, 10 or 12 years old, climbed the steps at the side, and, looking determined, marched across the platform to stand at the rail. The crowd quieted to hear her. "Please, dear Creator, hear our prayers. Keep Lord Rahl from making war," she said in a voice powered by simplistic adolescent zeal. She looked to her father. He nodded, and she went on. "We don't want this war. Please, dear Creator, make Lord Rahl give peace a chance." Richard felt as if an arrow of ice had pierced his heart. He wanted to explain to the child, explain 1,000 things, but he knew she would not understand a one of them. Kalin's hand on his back was cold comfort. Another girl, maybe a year or two younger, climbed the steps to join the first. "Please, dear Creator, make Lord Rahl give peace a chance." A line was forming, parents bearing children of all ages to the steps. They all had similar messages. Most stepped forward and simply said, "Give peace a chance," some not seeming to even comprehend the words they spoke before they returned to proud parents. It was plain to Richard that the children had been practicing the words all day. The words were not the language of children. That hardly softened the hurt, knowing they believed it. Some of the children were reluctant, some were nervous, but most seemed proud and happy to be part of the great event. By the passion in their voices, he could tell the older ones believed they were speaking profound words that had a chance to alter history and avert what was to them a pointless loss of life, a disaster for nothing of any good. A young boy asked, "Dear Creator, why does Lord Rahl want to hurt children? Make him give peace a chance." The crowd went wild cheering him. At seeing the reaction, he repeated it, and again it was cheered. Many in the crowd were weeping. Richard and Kalin shared a look beyond words. It was obvious to them both that this was no spontaneous outpouring of sentiment. This was a groomed and rehearsed message. They had been getting reports of this sort of thing, but to see it made his blood run cold. A man Richard recognized as a director named Previtt finally stepped up onto the platform. "Lord Rahl, Mother Confessor," the man shouted out over the crowd, "if you could hear me now, I would ask, why would you bring your vile magic to our peace-loving people? Why would you try to drag us into your war? A war we don't want. Listen to the children, for theirs are the words of wisdom. There is no reason to resort to conflict before dialogue. If you cared about the lives of innocent children, you would sit down with the Imperial Order and resolve your differences. The Order is willing, why are you not? Could it be you want this war, so you might conquer what isn't yours, so you may enslave those who reject you? Listen to the wise words of all these children, and please, in the name of all that is good, give peace a chance." The crowd took up the chant. "Give peace a chance. Give peace a chance. Give peace a chance." The man let it go on for a time, and then started in again. "Our new sovereign has much work to do for us. We desperately need his guiding hand. Why must Lord Rahl insist on distracting our sovereign from the work of the people? Why would Lord Rahl put our children at such great peril? For his greed," the man shouted in answer to his own questions. "For his greed." Kalin put a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. He felt little comfort. He was watching all his work being consumed by the heat from the flame of lies. "Dear Creator, Director Previtt called out, lifting his clasped hands to the sky.
"We give thanks for our new sovereign, a man of peerless talent and unrivaled devotion, the most ethical sovereign ever to reign over us. Please, dear Creator, give him strength against the wicked ways of Lord Rahl."
Director Previtt spread his arms.
"I ask you, good people, to consider this man from afar, a man who took the Mother Confessor of all the Midlands to be his wife."
The crowd grumbled in growing displeasure. The Mother Confessor, after all, was their Mother Confessor.
Yet this man who shouts for all to hear of his moral leadership, of his desire for what is right, already has another wife. Wherever he goes, he takes her too, fat with his child. Yet as this other wife still carries his unborn child, he marries the Mother Confessor and drags her with him too as his concubine. How many more women will this sinful man take to sire his wicked offspring? How many bastard children has he created here in Anderith? How many of our women have fallen to his boundless lust?"
The crowd was genuinely shocked. Besides the moral implications, this was a disgrace to the Mother Confessor.
"This other woman proudly admits being Lord Rahl's wife, and further confirms it to be his child. What kind of man is this?" Lady Chanbor was so shocked by this uncivilized conduct, she took to her bed, weeping to recover her senses. The sovereign is beside himself with the scandal of such behavior being brought into Anderith. They both ask that you reject this rutting pig from Dahara.
Du Shailu pulled on Richard's sleeve.
"This is not true. I will go explain it to them, so they may see it is not evil, as this man says. I will explain it."
Richard put a restraining hand on her. "You're doing no such thing. These people wouldn't listen." Jian spoke in heated words.
"Our spirit woman is not a woman who would be immoral. She must explain that she has acted by the law."
"Jian," Kalin said, "Richard and I know the truth. You and Du Shailu and the others with you, you all know the truth. That is what matters. These people have no ears for the truth. This is how tyrants win the will of the people, with lies." Having seen enough, Richard was about to turn to go when a bright orange whoosh of fire erupted out in the crowd. A candle, presumably, ignited a girl's dress. She let out a piercing scream. Her hair caught fire. By the speed of the fire, Richard realized it was no accident. The chimes were among them. Not far away, a man's clothes caught flame. The crowd went into a terrible fright, screaming in fear that Lord Rahl was using magic against them. It was a frightening, sickening sight, seeing the girl and the man flailing as crackling flames raced up their clothes, the sizzling fire catching as if they had been dunked in pitch, as if the fire were a thing alive. The crowd scattered in panic, knocking both old and young sprawling. Parents tried to cover the burning girl with a shirt to put out the fire, but it too ignited, adding fuel to the conflagration. The burning man crumbled to the ground. He was little more than a dark stick figure in the center of an intense yellow-orange blaze. As if the good spirits themselves could no longer stand it, the skies opened up in a downpour. The roar of the rain drumming the dry ground covered the roar of the fire and the shouts and cries of the people. Darkness descended as the candles were extinguished by the rain. In the square, 2 fires continued to burn, the girl and the man. The chimes danced over their flesh in liquid light. There was nothing to be done for the 2 souls lost. If Richard didn't do something, there would be nothing to be done for anyone. The chimes would consume the world of life. Kalin pulled Richard away. It required little effort. They ran back through the darkness and rain and gathered up their horses and the rest of the men. Richard, leading his horse by the reins, guided them to a side route through Fairfield. "The reports were accurate," Richard said as he leaned toward Kalin. "It's clear these people have been turned against us."
"Fortunately, the vote is only a few days off," Kalin answered back through the din of rain. "We may lose some people here, but at least we have a chance with the rest of Anderith."
As they walked their horses through the rain, Richard moved the reins to his other hand and put an arm around Kalin's shoulders. "Truth will win out." Kalin didn't answer.
"The important thing is the chimes," Du Shailu said.
She looked both saddened and frightened.
"Whatever else happens, the chimes must be stopped. I do not want to die again by them."
I do not want our child to die by them. Whatever happens here, this is only one place. The chimes, though, are everywhere. I do not want to bring my baby into a world with the chimes. There will be no safe place if they are not stopped. That is your true job, Kaharin."
Richard put his arm around her shoulders. I know. Maybe I can find the thing I need in the library at the estate."
"The minister and sovereign have taken the other side," Kaelin said. "They may not be interested in allowing us to use the library any longer."
"We're using it," Richard said, "one way or another." He guided them down a street that paralleled the main avenue, a street that once out of the city would turn to join into the main road toward the minister's estate. It was on that road, closer to the estate, that their troops were stationed. Richard noticed Kaelin staring off at something. He followed her gaze in the rain and darkness to a small sign visible in the lamplight coming from a window beneath it. The sign offered herbs for sale and the services of a midwife. Du Shailu was huge. Richard supposed that she must be near to having her baby, whether she wanted it to be born into such a world or not. Chapter 61. It had been a long day, the last hour of it spent slogging through the drenching downpour to where the remainder of their troops were stationed. Well over half of them had been sent off around Andereth to oversee the upcoming vote. Feeling ill, Du Shailu was in no condition to ride. It was a miserable walk, and exhaustion finally claimed her, not something she would have admitted lightly. Richard and Jian took turns carrying her the remaining distance. Richard was thankful for the rain for one reason, though. It had cooled the tempers of the throng in Fairfield and sent them home. Ordinarily, Richard would have insisted that Du Shailu go straight off to her own tent, but after the events in Fairfield, he understood her gloomy mood and realized she needed their company more than she needed rest. Kaelin must have understood, too, for rather than chasing the spirit woman from their tent, as she had had to do on more than one occasion, she gave her a dried tava biscuit to suck on, saying it would settle her stomach. Kaelin sat Du Shailu down on the padded blanket that was the bed, and with a towel dried her face and hair while Jian went to get her some dry clothes. Richard sat at the small folding table he used to write messages, orders, and letters, mostly to General Rybish. After having been to the city, he desperately wanted to write the general and order him into Andereth. From outside the tent, a muffled voice asked permission to enter. When Richard granted it, Captain Meifert lifted back the heavy flap, propping it up with a pole to act as a little roof to keep the rain from their doorway. He shook himself as best he could under the small roof before stepping inside. "Captain," Richard said, "I would like to compliment you and your men on the reports. They have been dead accurate about what's going on in Fairfield. The spirits know I wish I could yell at you and dismiss the messengers for getting it wrong or embellishing the facts, but I can't. They were only too right." Captain Meifert didn't look pleased to have gotten it right. The situation was nothing to be pleased about. With a finger, he wiped his wet blonde hair across his forehead. "Lord Rahl, I believe we should now bring General Rybish's army south into Andereth. The situation is growing more tenuous by the day. I have a fistful of reports about special Ander Guard troops. They are reported to be not at all like the regular Andereth army we have seen." "I agree with the captain," Kaelin said from the ground beside Du Shailu. "We need to be in the library, trying to find something of use against the chimes. We don't have time to counter the things being said to sway people to reject us." "That's just here," Richard said. "Are you so sure? What if it's not? Besides, as I said, we don't have the luxury of time to devote to it. We have more important things to worry about." "The Mother Confessor is right," Captain Meifert insisted. "I have to believe truth will win out. Otherwise, what is there left to do? Lie to people to get them to join our side?" "It seems to be working for those who oppose us," Kaelin pointed out. Richard wiped his wet hair back from his forehead. "Look, there's nothing I would like better than to simply call General Rybish down here. Really, there isn't. But we can't." Captain Meifert wiped water from his chin. The man seemed to have anticipated the reason for Richard's reluctance, and was ready with a reply. "Lord Rahl, we have enough men here. We can send word to the general, and before he comes into sight, we can take the Domini Dirch from the Andereth army and safely let our men through." I've run that very thought through my mind 1,000 times, Richard said. One thing keeps ringing a warning in my head.
What's that? Kaelin asked.
Richard turned sideways on a small folding stool so he might speak to her as well as the captain. We don't know for sure how the Domini Dirch work.
So we ask someone here, Kaelin said.
It's not a weapon they use. We can't count on their expertise. Yes, they know that if they're being attacked, they ring the things and the enemy will be killed. Lord Thrall, we have 1,000 men, once they all return from watching the vote. We can take the Domini Dirch in a wide swath, and General Rybish will be able to safely bring his army through. Then we can use his men to take the rest all along the frontier, and the Imperial Order will not be able to get through. Perhaps they will even approach, thinking they will be able to pass, and then we will have the opportunity to use the Domini Dirch against them. Richard turned the candle on the table round and round in his fingers as he listened, and then in the silence that followed. There's one problem with that, he said at last. And that is what I've already said. We aren't sure how they work.
We know the basics of the things, Kaelin said, her frustration growing.
But the problem is, Richard said, that we don't know enough. First of all, we can't take all the Domini Dirch all along the frontier. There are too many. They run along the entire border. We could only take some, like you suggested, Captain. Therein lies the problem. Remember when we came through, how those people were killed when the Domini Dirch rang?
Yes, but we don't know why they rang, Kaelin said. Besides, what difference does that make?
What if we capture a stretch of the Domini Dirch, Richard said, looking back and forth between Kaelin and Captain Meifert, and then tell General Rybish it's safe to bring his army in? What if, when all those men are just about there, Anderith soldiers somewhere else, one still in control of the Domini Dirch, ring theirs?
So what? Kaelin asked. They will be too far away.
Are you sure? Richard leaned toward her for emphasis. What if that rings them all? What if they know how to ring the entire line? Remember when we came in, how they said they all rang, and everyone out in front of the Domini Dirch was killed? They all rang together as one.
But they didn't know why they all rang, Kaelin said. The soldiers didn't ring them.
How do you know that one person somewhere along that entire line didn't ring their Domini Dirch and caused them all to ring? Maybe accidentally, and they're too afraid to admit it for fear of their punishment. Or perhaps one of those young people stationed there out of boredom just wanted to try it. What if the same thing happens while our army is out there before those murderous things? Can you imagine? General Rybish has near to 100,000 men, maybe more by now. Can you imagine his entire force killed in one instant? Richard looked from Kaelin's calm face to the captain's alarmed expression. Our entire army down here in the south at once dead. Imagine it.
But I don't think, Kaelin began.
And are you willing to risk the lives of all those young men on what you think? Are you so sure? I don't know that the Domini Dirch work together like that, but what if they do? Maybe one rung in anger rings them all. Can you say it won't? I'm not willing to put the innocent lives of those brave men to such a deadly gamble. Are you? Richard looked back to Captain Meifert. Are you? Are you a gambler, Captain? Could you so easily wager the lives of all those men? He shook his head. If it was my own life, Lord Thrall, I would willingly risk it. But not for all those lives. The roar eased up as the rain slowed a little. Men went by outside the opening of the tent, taking feed to the horses. For the most part, the camp sat in pitch blackness. Fires were forbidden, except where essential.
I can't disagree with that.
Kaelin lifted her hands and then in frustration let them drop back into her lap.
But Jagang is coming. If we don't win the people to our cause so they will stand against him, he will take Anderith. He will be invincible behind the Domini Dirch, and be able to stab into the Midlands at will and bleed us to death.
Richard listened to the rain drumming on the tent roof and splashing outside the open doorway. It sounded like the kind of steady rain that was going to be with them for the night. Richard spoke softly.
As I see it, we have only one option. We must go back to the library at the estate and see if we can find anything useful. We haven't yet, Kalen said. And with the people in charge now taking a stand against us, Captain Myford said, they might resist that. Richard made a fist on the table as he met the man's blue-eyed gaze. Richard once again wished he had the sword of truth with him. If they resist, Captain, then you and your men will be called upon to do what you constantly train for. If they resist, and if we have to, we'll cut down anyone who lifts a finger to oppose us, and then we'll level the place. We just need to get the books out of there first. Relief eased the expression on the man's face. The Daharans seemed to harbor a fear that Richard might be unwilling to act. Captain Myford looked assuaged to hear otherwise. Yes, Lord Rahl. The men will be ready in the morning when you are. Kalen's point about there possibly being nothing of value in the estate was worrisome. Richard remembered the books in the library. While he couldn't recall the details of the information, he remembered the subjects well enough to know that finding the answer was a long shot. Still, it was the only shot they had. Before I go, Captain Myford pulled a paper from his pocket. I thought you should know a number of people have requested an audience when you have time, Lord Rahl. Most of them were merchants, wanting information. Thank you, Captain. But I don't have time now. I understand, Lord Rahl. I took the liberty of telling them as much. He shuffled his little notes. There was one woman. He squinted in the dim candlelight to make out the name. Franca Gowenlock. She said it was extremely urgent, but would give no information. She was here most of the day. She finally said she had to return to her home, but she would be back tomorrow. If it's important, she'll be back and I'll talk to her. Richard looked down at Du Chaillu to see how she was feeling. She looked comforted by Kalen's care. Behind him rose a sudden commotion. The captain pitched backward with a cry as if felled by magic. The candle flame fluttered wildly at the intrusion of a wind, but stayed lit. Richard spun to the sound of a dull thump. The candle wobbled across the top of the shuddering table, right up to the edge. A huge raven had crashed, sprawling onto the tabletop. Richard scooted back in surprise, drawing his sword as he stood, wishing again that it were the sword of truth with its attendant magic. Kalen and Du Chaillu shot to their feet. The raven had something black in its big beak. With all the confusion, the wind, the candle nearly toppling, the flame fluttering, the table teetering, and the tent sides flapping, he didn't immediately recognize the object in the raven's beak. The raven set it on the table. The inky black bird, water beaded on glossy feathers like the night itself come into their tent, looked exhausted. The way it lay sprawled on the table with its wings open, Richard didn't think it was well, or possibly it was injured. Richard didn't know if a thing possessed of the chimes could really be injured. He recalled the chicken that wasn't a chicken bleeding. He saw a smear of blood on the tabletop. Whenever that chime in a chicken had been around, even if he couldn't see it, the hairs at the back of Richard's neck had stood up. Yet with this raven that wasn't a raven right before him on the table, he hadn't reacted that way. The raven cocked its head, looking Richard in the eye. It was as deliberate a look as he'd ever gotten. With its beak, the bird tapped the center of the thing it had laid on the table. Captain Myford sprang up then and swung his sword. At the same time, Richard flung up his arms, shouting, "No!" The raven, as the sword came down, hurled itself off the table onto the ground and ran between the captain's legs. Once past the man, it took wing and was gone. "Sorry," the captain said. I thought it was attacking you with magic, Lord Rahl. I thought it was a thing of dark magic come to attack you." Richard let out a deep breath as he gestured forgiveness to the man. The man was only trying to protect him. "It was not evil," Du Chaillu said in a soft voice as she and Kalen came closer. Richard sank back down on his stool. No, it wasn't. Kalen and Du Chaillu stood over his shoulder looking. "What omen did the messenger from the spirits bring you?" the spirit woman asked. "I don't think it was from the spirit world," Richard said. He picked up the small, flat object. In the dim light, he suddenly realized what it was. He stared incredulously. It was just like the one Sister Verna used to carry. He had seen her use it countless times. It's a journey book. He opened the cover. "That has to be High Daharan,"
Calen said of the strange script. "Dear spirits," Richard breathed, as he read the only 2 words on the first page.
"What?" Calen asked. "What is it? What does it say?"
"Fuer Berglinsdurch." "You're right. It's Haida Haran."
"Do you know the meaning?"
"It says, the mountain." Richard turned and peered up at her in the flickering candlelight. That was Joseph Anders' cognomen. This is Joseph Anders' journey book. The other, the one that was destroyed, its twin, was called Mountain's Twin. Chapter 62. Dalton smiled as he stood at an octagonal table of rare black walnut in the reliquary in the Office of Cultural Amity, where displayed on the walls around the room were objects belonging to past directors, robes, small tools, implements of their profession, such as pens and beautifully carved blotters, and writings. Dalton was looking over more modern writings, reports he had requested from the directors. Any ambivalence the directors might feel they kept to themselves. Publicly, they now threw themselves into the task of supporting the new sovereign. It had been made plain to them that their very existence now depended not only upon their fealty, but upon their enthusiasm in that devotion. As he read the script of addresses they were to deliver, Dalton was annoyed by shouts coming in through an open window overlooking the city square. It sounded like an angry mob of people. Judging by the boisterous encouragement from the crowd, he assumed it was someone delivering a diatribe against Lord Rall and the Mother Confessor. Following the lead of noted people such as the directors, ordinary people had now taken to loudly voicing the tailored notions they had been fed. Even though Dalton had expected it, he never failed to find it remarkable the way he had but to say a thing enough times, through enough people, and it became the popular truth, its provenance lost as it was mimicked by ordinary people who came to believe that it was their own idea, as if original thought routinely came forth from their witless minds of clay. Dalton let out a bitter snort of contempt. They were asses, and deserved the fate they embraced. They belonged to the Imperial Order now. Or at least they soon would. He glanced out the window to see a throng making its way into the city square. The heavy rain of the night before had turned to a light drizzle, so people were coming back out. The steady downpour overnight failed to wash away the blackened places on the cobble paving in the square where the 2 people had burned to death. The crowd, of course, blamed the tragedy on the magic of Lord Rall, venting his wrath against them. Dalton had instructed his people to bitterly make the accusation, knowing the seriousness of the charge would outweigh the lack of evidence, much less the truth. What had really happened, Dalton didn't know. He did know this was far from the first such incident. Whatever it was an appalling misfortune, but if misfortune was to happen, it could have hardly picked a better time. It had punctuated Director Previtt's speech perfectly. Dalton wondered if the fires had anything to do with what Franca had told him about magic failing. He didn't see how, but he didn't think she had told him everything either. The woman had been behaving quite oddly of late. At the knock, Dalton turned to the door. Rowley bowed. "What is it?" "Minister," Rowley said, "the woman is here. The one Emperor Jagang sent." "Where is she?" "Down the hall. She is having tea." Dalton shifted his scabbard at his hip. This was not a woman to trifle with. She was said to have more power than any ordinary such woman. More power even than Franca. Jagang had assured him, though, that unlike Franca, this woman still had firm control of her power. "Take her to the estate. Give her one of our finest rooms. If she gives you any—" Dalton recalled Franca's talent for overhearing things. "If she gives you any complaints, see to resolving them to her satisfaction. She is a most important guest, and is to be treated as such." Rowley bowed. "Yes, Minister." Dalton saw Rowley smile with one side of his mouth. He, too, knew why the woman was there. Rowley was looking forward to it. Dalton just wanted it done with. It would require care. They had to wait and pick their own time. They couldn't force it, or the whole thing could come undone. If they handled it right, though, it would be a great accomplishment. Jagang would be more than grateful. "I appreciate your generosity." Dalton turned at the sound of a woman's voice. She had stepped into the doorway. Rowley backed out of her way. She looked middle-aged, with gray hair mixing in with the black. Her simple, dowdy, dark blue dress ran from her neck, over her rather thick-boned shape, and all the way to the floor. Her presence was dominated by a smile that only vaguely touched her lips, but was ever so evident in her brown eyes. It was as nasty a simper as Dalton had ever seen. It unashamedly proclaimed a mien of superiority. Because of the lines at the corners of her mouth and eyes, the self-satisfied smirk seemed enduringly etched on her face. A gold ring pierced her lower lip. "And you would be?" he asked.
"Sister Penthea, here to wield my talent in service to His Excellency, Emperor Jagang."
Her smooth flow of words was laced with crystalline frost. Dalton bowed his head. "Minister of Culture, Dalton Campbell. Thank you for coming, Sister Penthea. We are most appreciative of your courtesy in lending your unique assistance." She had been sent to wield her talent in service to Dalton Campbell, but he thought better of putting too fine a point on it. Dalton didn't need to remind her she was the one with a ring through her lip. It was obvious to them both. At the sound of screams, Dalton again glanced across the room out the window, thinking it was the parents or family returned to see the site of the grisly deaths the night before. People had been coming by all morning, leaving flowers or other offerings at the site of the deaths, until they looked like a grotesque garden midden. Frequent wails of anguish rose up into the gray day. Sister Penthea turned his attention to business.
"I need to see the ones chosen for the deed."
Dalton motioned with a hand. "Rowley there, he will be one of them." Without word or warning, she slapped the palm of her hand to Rowley's forehead. Her fingers splayed into his red hair, grasping his head as if she might pluck it like a ripe pear. Rowley's eyes rolled back in his head. His entire body began to tremble. The sister murmured thick words that had no meaning to Dalton. Each, as it oozed forth, seemed to take root in Rowley. The young man's arms flinched when she stressed particular words. With the last phrase, raising an intonation, she gave Rowley's head a sharp shove. Letting out a small cry, Rowley crumpled as if his bones had dissolved. In a moment he sat up and shook his head. A smile told Dalton he was fine. He brushed clean his dark brown trousers as he stood, looking no different, despite his added lethality.
"The others?"
she asked. Dalton gestured dismissively. "Rowley can take you to them." She bowed slightly.
"Good day, then, Minister. I will see to it immediately. The Emperor also wished me to express his pleasure at being able to be of assistance. Either way, muscle or magic, the Mother Confessor's fate is now sealed." She wheeled around and stormed away, Rowley following in her wake. Dalton couldn't say he was sorry to see her go. Before he could return to reading his reports in earnest, he again heard the cheering. The sight when he lifted his head to look out the window was unexpected. Someone was being dragged into the square, a mob of people following behind as the people already in the square parted to make way, cheering on those entering, some of whom carried scraps of crates, tree branches, and sheafs of straw. Dalton went to the window and leaned on the sill with both hands as he peered down at the sight. It was Seren Rajak, at the head of a few hundred of his followers, all dressed in white robes. When he saw who they were dragging into the square, who was screaming, Dalton gasped aloud. His heart pounding with dread, he stared out the window, wondering what he could do. He had guards with him, real guards, not Anderith army soldiers, but 24 men. He realized it was a futile thought even as he had it. Armed though they were, they stood no chance against the thousands in the square. Dalton knew better than to stand before a crowd intent on violence. That was only a good way to have the violence turned your way. Despite his feelings, Dalton dared not side against the people in this. Among the men with Seren Rajak, in among the man's followers, Dalton saw one in a dark uniform. Stein. With icy dread, Dalton realized the reason Stein was there and what he wanted. Dalton backed away from the window. He was no stranger to violence, but this was an atrocity. At last he ran back into the corridor that echoed his footfalls, descended the steps, and raced down the hall. He didn't know what to do, but if there was anything... He reached the entry set behind fluted stone columns outside the building, at the top of the cascade of steps. He halted, well back in the shadows of the interior, assessing the situation.
Outside on the landing, partway down the steps, guards patrolled to keep people from thoughts of coming up into the Office of Cultural Amity. It was a symbolic gesture. This many people would easily sweep aside the guards. Dalton dared not give people in such a foul mood a reason to turn their anger to him. A woman holding the hand of a young boy pulled him along as she pushed her way to the front of the crowd.
"I am Nora," she proclaimed to the people. "This is my son, Bruce. He's all I got left because of witches. My husband, Julian, was drowned because of a dark curse from a witch. My beautiful daughter, Bethany, was burned up alive by a witch's spell."
The boy, Bruce, wept, mumbling it was true, wept for his father and sister. Saren Rajak held up the woman's arm. "Here is a victim of the Keeper's witchcraft." He pointed to a wailing woman near the front. "There is another. Many of you here have been harmed by curses and hexes from witches. Witches using evil from the Keeper of the Dead." With a crowd in this ugly a mood, Dalton knew this could come to no good end, but he could think of nothing to do to stop it. It was, after all, the reason he had released Saren Rajak, to rouse anger against magic. He needed people to be stirred up against those with magic, to see them as evil. Who better than a zealot to foment such hatred? "And here is the witch." Saren Rajak thrust his arm out to point at the woman whose hands were bound behind her, the woman Stein held by the hair. "She is the Keeper's vile tool. She casts evil spells to harm you all." The mob was yelling and screaming for vengeance. "What should we do with this witch?" Rajak shrieked. "Burn her! Burn her! Burn her!" came the chant. Saren Rajak flung his arms toward the sky. "Dear Creator, we commend this woman to your care in the flames. If she be innocent, spare her harm. If she be guilty of the crime of witchcraft, burn her." As men threw up a pole, Stein bore his captive face down to the ground. He pulled her head up by her hair. With his other hand, he brought up his knife. Dalton, his eyes wide, was unable to blink, to breathe, as he watched Stein slice from one ear to the other across the top of Franca's forehead. Her scream ripped Dalton's insides as Stein ripped back her scalp. Tears ran down Dalton's cheeks as blood ran down Franca's face. Shrieking in pain and immeasurable terror, she was lifted and bound to the pole. The whites of her eyes stood out from a mask of blood. Franca didn't argue for her innocence or beg for her life. She just screamed in paralyzed horror. Straw and wood were thrown up around her. The mob pressed in, wanting to be close, to see it all. Some reached out and stole a swipe at the blood coursing down her face, eager for a memento of witch's blood on their fingertips, to prove their power before they sent her to the Keeper. Horror dragging him by his throat, Dalton staggered partway down the steps. Men with torches pushed through to the front of the roaring mob. Saren Rajak, wild with rage, climbed the clutter of wood and straw at her feet to shout in Franca's face, to call her every sort of vile name and accuse her of every sort of evil crime. Dalton, standing helpless on the steps, knew all the words to be false. Franca was not one of those things. Just then, a most extraordinary thing happened. A raven swooped down from the gray sky, fixing its angry claws in Saren Rajak's hair. Saren screamed that it was the witch's familiar come to protect its mistress. The crowd responded by throwing things at the bird, while at the same time Saren tried to fight it off. The bird flapped and squawked, but held on to the man's hair. With such frightening determination that Dalton began to think that the charges it was the witch's familiar seemed true. The huge, inky black bird used its beak to stab out Saren's good eye. The man screamed in pain and rage as he fell from the tinder around Franca. As he did, the mob heaved on the torches. A wail such as Dalton had never heard rose from poor Franca as the flames exploded through the dry straw and up the length of her. Even from where he stood, Dalton could smell the burning flesh. And then, in her terror, in her pain, in her burning death, Franca turned her head and saw Dalton standing there on the steps. She screamed his name. Over the roar of the crowd, he couldn't hear it, but he could read it on her lips. She screamed it again and screamed she loved him. When Dalton read those words on her lips, they crushed his heart. The flames blistered her flesh till the scream pushed from her lungs sounded like the shriek of the lost souls in the world of the dead. Dalton stood numb, watching it, realizing only then that his hands were holding his head and he was screaming too. The crowd surged forward, eager to smell the roasting flesh, to see the witch's skin burn. They were wild with excitement, their eyes mad with it. As the mob pressed in, the ones in front were pushed so close it singed off their eyebrows, and this too they relished, as the witch screamed and burned. On the ground, the raven was pecking wildly at the blinded, almost forgotten Seren Rajak. He swung his arms, unseeing, trying to get the vengeful bird away. Darting in between his flailing arms, the raven's big beak snatched, twisted, and tore chunks of flesh from his face. The crowd began pelting the bird anew with anything handy. The bird, finally looking as if it was losing strength, flapped helplessly as everything from shoes to flaming branches arced through the air toward it. For reasons he didn't understand, Dalton, weeping, found himself cheering the bird against all odds, knowing it too was about to die. Just as it looked as if the end was near for the valiant avenging raven, a riderless horse charged into the square. Blocked by the mob, it reared wildly, knocking people aside. It spun and kicked, injuring people, snapping bones, breaking heads. People fell back as the golden chestnut-colored horse, ears pinned back, snorting with an angry scream, charged into the center of the crowd. Frightened people, trying to fall back, were unable to make way for the press of other people behind them. The horse, seeming to have gone insane with anger, trampled anyone in its way to get to the center of the square. Dalton had never heard of a horse running toward a fire. As it reached the middle of the melee, the raven, with a last desperate effort, flapped its great black wings and made it up onto the horse's back. When the horse wheeled, Dalton thought for a moment that it had another bird on it, as if there were two black ravens, but then he realized the second was just a splotch of black color on the horse's rump. With the raven's claws clutching the horse's mane just above the withers, the horse reared up one last time before coming down and charging off in a dead run. The people who could leaped out of the way. Those unable to do so were trampled by the enraged beast. Alone on the steps, Franca's screams thankfully ended. Dalton saluted the golden chestnut mare and avenging raven as they fled at a full gallop from the city center. Chapter 63. Beata squinted out over the plains in the dawn light. It was good to see that the sun was going to shine once it reached the horizon. The rain of the last few days had been wearing. Now there were only a few dark purple clouds, like a child's charcoal scribbles across the golden eastern sky. From up on the stone base of the Domini Dirch, beneath that immense sweep of sky overhead, she could see forever, it seemed, out onto the vast plains of the wilds. Beata saw that Estelle Ruffin was right in calling her up top. In the distance, a rider was coming. He was taking the dry ground right toward them. The rider was still a goodly distance, but by the way he was running his horse, he didn't look like he intended to stop. Beata waited until he was a little closer, and then cupped her hands around her mouth and yelled, "Halt! Halt where you are!" Still he came on. He was probably still too far away to hear her. The plains were deceptive. Sometimes it took a rider much longer to reach them than it seemed it should. "What should we do?" Estelle asked, having never had a rider approach so fast before, looking like he didn't intend to stop. Beata was finally used to Anders relying on her and asking her for instructions. She was not only getting used to her authority, she had come to delight in it. It was ironic. Bertrand Chanbour had made the laws that enabled Beata to join the army and command Anders, and Bertrand Chanbour had caused her to avail herself of the laws. She hated him, and at the same time he was her unwitting benefactor. Now that he was sovereign, she tried, as was her duty, and hard as it was, to feel only love for him. Just the night before, Captain Tolbert had come by with some Daharan soldiers. They were riding down the line of Domini Dirch to take the votes of the squads stationed at each weapon. They'd all talked about it, and though Beata didn't see their votes, she knew her squad all marked an X. Beata had a strong feeling about Lord Rahl, having met and talked to him, that he was a good man. The Mother Confessor, too, seemed much kinder than Beata had expected. Still, Beata and her squad were proud to be in the Anderith army, the best army in the world, Captain Tolbert told them, an army undefeated since the creation of the land and invincible now. Beata had responsibility. She was a soldier who commanded respect now, just as Bertrand Chanbor's law said. She didn't want anything to change. Even though it was for Bertrand Chanbor their new sovereign, and against Lord Rall, Beata had proudly marked an X. Emmeline had her hand on the striker, and Carl stood close to it too, anticipating Beata ordering it out. Beata instead motioned the two away from the thing. "There's only one rider," Beata said in a calm voice of authority, settling their nerves. Estelle heaved a sigh in frustration. "But, Sergeant, we are trained soldiers. One man is no threat. We know how to fight. We've been trained in combat." Carl shifted his sword on his weapons belt, eager for the responsibility of doing some real soldiering. Beata snapped her fingers, pointing to the steps. "Go, Carl. Get Norris and Annette. The three of you meet me down at the front line. Emmeline, you stay up here with Estelle. But I want both of you to stand away from the striker. I'll not have you ringing this weapon for no more threat than a lone rider. We'll handle it. Just stay at your post and keep watch." Both women saluted with a hand to their brow. Carl did a quick version before he raced down the steps, breathless with the possibility of real action. Beata straightened her sword at her hip and went down the steps in a dignified manner more befitting her rank. Beata stood beside the huge stone weapon at the line, as they called it. Beyond, the Dominie Dirch would kill. She clasped her hands behind her back as Carl raced up with Norris and Annette. Annette was still putting on her chainmail. Beata finally understood the shouts coming from the rider racing toward them. He was screaming for them not to ring the Dominie Dirch. Beata thought she recognized the voice. Carl had his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Sergeant?" She nodded, and the two men and one woman drew steel. It was the first time they'd done so for a potential threat. They were all three beaming with the thrill of it. Beata cupped her hands around her mouth again. "Halt!" This time the rider heard her. He hauled back on the reins and drew his lathered horse to a stumbling, clumsy halt a little distance out. Beata's jaw dropped. "Fitch!" He grinned. "Beata, is that you?" He dismounted and walked his horse toward her. The horse looked in sorry shape. Fitch didn't look much better, but he still managed to swagger. "Fitch," Beata growled. "Get over here!" Disappointed that Beata knew the man and there didn't look like there was going to be any sword play, Carl, Norris, and Annette returned their weapons to their scabbards. They all stared openly, though, at the weapon Fitch was wearing. It was held on with a baldric running over the right shoulder opposite the sword and scabbard at his left hip, thereby helping balance the weight. The leather of the baldric was finely tooled and looked old. Beata knew leatherwork and hadn't seen anything that fine. The scabbard was embellished with simply peerless silver and gold work. The sword itself was remarkable, what she could see anyway. It had a downswept, bright work crossguard. The hilt looked wound in silver wire with a bit of gold, too, glinting in the early light. Fitch, chest puffed up, smiled at her. "Good to see you, Beata. I'm glad to see you got the job you were after. I guess both of us got our dream after all." Beata knew she had earned her dream. Having known Fitch a good long time, she doubted the same of him. "Fitch, what are you doing here? And what are you doing with that weapon?" His chin lifted. "It's mine. I told you that someday I'd be Seeker, and now I am. This here is the sword of truth." Beata stared down at it. Fitch turned the weapon out a little, so she could see the hilt with writing in gold wire. It was the word Fitch had drawn in the dust that one day at the minister's estate. She remembered it. Truth. "The wizards gave you that?" Beata pointed, incredulous. "The wizards named you Seeker of Truth?" "Well," Fitch glanced back over his shoulder out to the wilds. "It's a long story, Beata." "Sergeant Beata," she said, not about to be outdone by the likes of Fitch. He shrugged. "Sergeant? That's great, Beata." He glanced over his shoulder again. Can I talk to you?" He cast a wary eye to those watching their every word. "Alone?" "Fitch, I don't. Please." He looked worried, like she'd never seen him before. Behind the cocky attitude, he was distraught. Beata took hold of his filthy messenger's jacket at the collar and pulled him along, away from the others. All their eyes followed. Beata guessed she didn't blame them. It was the most interesting thing that had happened since the day the Mother Confessor and Lord Rall came through.
What are you doing with that sword? It isn't yours.
Fitch's face took on the familiar pleading expression she knew so well.
Beata, I had to take it. I had to. You stole it. You stole the sword of truth.
I had to.
You don't... Fitch, you are a thief.
I should arrest you and... Well, that would be fine by me. Then I could prove the charges are false. She frowned.
What charges?
That I raped you.
Beata was thunderstruck. She couldn't even say anything.
I got accused of what the minister and Stein did to you. I need this sword of truth to help me prove the truth. That I didn't do it. That the minister is the one who did it and...
He's the sovereign now.
Fitch sagged.
Then not even this sword will help me. The sovereign. Boy, this is a real mess.
You got that right. He seemed to get life back in him. He seized her by her shoulders.
Beata, you got to help me. There's a crazy woman after me. Use the Domini Dirch. Stop her. You can't let her through. Why? She the one you stole the sword from?
Beata, you don't understand.
You stole that sword. But it's me that don't understand?
I understand you're a liar. Fitch sagged.
Beata, she murdered Morley.
Beata's eyes widened. She knew how big Morley was.
You mean she has magic or something?
Fitch looked up.
Magic. Yes, that must be it. She has magic. Beata, she's crazy. She killed Morley. Imagine that. Someone kills the thief and that makes her a crazy murderer. You are a worthless Haken, Fitch. That's all you are. A worthless Haken who stole a sword that doesn't belong to them and they never could earn. Beata, please. She's going to kill me. Please don't let her through.
Ryda's coming, Estelle called out. Fitch nearly jumped out of his skin. Beata looked up at Estelle but saw she was pointing to the rear, not out to the wilds. Beata relaxed a bit.
Who are they?
She called up at Estelle.
Can't tell yet, Sergeant. Fitch, you got to give that thing back. When this woman comes, you have to...
Ryder coming, Sergeant, Emmeline called, pointing out to the wilds.
What'd she look like?
Fitch called up, frantic as a cat with its tail afire. Emmeline looked out to the plains for a minute.
I don't know. She's too far away.
Red, Fitch called.
Does it look like she's in red?
Emmeline peered off another minute.
Blonde hair wearing red.
Let her pass, Beata ordered.
Yes, Sergeant.
Fitch threw up his arms, looking suddenly terrified.
Beata, what are you doing? You want to get me killed? She's crazy. The woman is a monster. She's...
We'll have a talk with her. Don't worry. We'll not let the little boy get hurt. We'll find out what she wants and take care of it. Fitch looked hurt. That did not displease Beata, not after all the trouble he was causing. After he stole something as valuable as the Sword of Truth, a valuable thing of magic. Now the fool boy had gone and got his friend Morley involved in thieving and got him killed for it. And to think, she once thought she could fall in love with Fitch. He hung his head.
Beata, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make you proud. Thieving is not something to be proud of, Fitch.
You just don't understand, he muttered on the verge of tears.
You just don't understand.
Beata heard an odd ruckus from the next Domini Dirch. Shouts and such, but no alarm. As she turned to look, she saw the 3 special Anderith guards trotting in on their horses, the ones Estelle had spotted. She wondered what they would want. She turned to the sound of the galloping horse coming in. Beata jabbed a finger against Fitch's chest.
Now you just keep quiet and let me do the talking.
Rather than answer, he stared at the ground. Beata turned and saw the horse race past the stone base. The woman was indeed wearing red. Beata had never seen anything like it, a red leather outfit from head to toe. Her long blonde braid was flying out behind. Beata's guard went up. She had never seen a look of determination such as was on this woman's face. She didn't even bother to halt her horse. She simply dove off it at Fitch. Beata shoved Fitch out of the way. The woman rolled twice and came up on her feet.
Hold on, Beata cried. I told him we'd settle this with you, and he'd give you back what's yours.
Beata was baffled to see that the woman held a black bottle by its neck. To dive off a horse with a bottle. Maybe Fitch was right. Maybe she was crazy. She didn't look crazy. But she did look resolved to carry this matter into the next world if she had to. The woman, her sky-blue eyes fixed on Fitch, ignored Beata.
Give it over now, and I'll not kill you. I'll only make you regret being born.
Fitch, instead of giving up, drew the sword. It made a ring of steel such as Beata, used to the sound of blades, had never heard. Fitch got a strange look on his face. His eyes were going wide, like he might faint or something. His eyes had a decidedly strange look in them, a shimmering light that gave Beata gooseflesh. It was a look of some kind of awesome inner vision. The woman held the bottle out in one hand like it was a weapon. With her other hand she waggled her fingers, taunting Fitch to come closer, to attack her. Beata stepped in to restrain the woman until they could talk it over. Beata next realized she was sitting on the ground. Her face stung something fierce.
"Stay out of it," the woman said in a voice like ice. "There is no need for you to be hurt. Do yourself a favor and stay down."
Her blue eyes turned to Fitch.
"Come on, boy. Either give it up or do something about it."
Fitch did something about it. He swung the sword. Beata could hear the tip whistle going through the air. The woman danced back a step and at the same time thrust with the black bottle. The sword shattered it into 1,000 pieces that filled the air like a storm cloud. "Ha!" the woman cried in triumph. She grinned wickedly.
"Now I'll take the sword."
She flicked her wrist. When she did, a red leather rod hanging on a gold chain at her wrist spun up into her hand. At first, she looked expectantly overjoyed, but the look turned to confusion and then to bafflement as she stared at the thing in her hand. "It should work," she mumbled to herself. "It should work!" When she looked up, she saw something that brought her back to her senses. Beata glanced over but didn't see anything odd. The woman seized Beata's outfit at the shoulder and hauled her to her feet. "Get your people out of here! Get them out now!" "What? Fitch is right. You are—" She thrust her arm out, pointing. "Look, you fool!" The special Andereth guards were coming toward them, chatting among themselves. "Those are our men. They're nothing to worry." "Get your people out of here right now or you will all die!" Beata huffed at being ordered about by some crazy woman treating her like a child. She called over to Corporal Marie Falvel, not 20 feet away, as she was walking out to see what the commotion was all about. "Corporal Falvel!" Beata called out. "Yes, Sergeant?" the Ander woman asked. "Have those men wait there until we get this settled." Beata put her fists on her hips as she turned to the woman in red. "Satisfied?" The woman ground her teeth and grabbed Beata's shoulder again. "You little fool! Get you and your other children moving right now or you will all die!" Beata was getting angry. "I'm an officer in the Andereth army, and those men—" Beata turned to point. Marie Falvel stepped in front of the men, held up a hand, and told them they would have to wait. One of the three unceremoniously drew his sword and swung it with casual but frightening power. Accompanied by the sickening thwack of blade hitting bone, it cut Marie clean in half. Beata stood stupefied, not really believing what she was seeing. Working for a butcher, she'd seen so much slaughtering it hardly ever warranted a second look. She'd cleaned the guts from so many different animals that seeing guts seemed to her just a natural thing. Guts didn't appall Beata in the least. Seeing Marie there on the ground, with her guts spilling out of her top half, in one way seemed only a curiosity. A human animal's guts so similar to other animals, but human. Marie Falvel, separated from her hips and legs, gasped, clutching at the grass, her eyes wide as her brain tried to comprehend the shock of what had just happened to her body. It was so dauntingly horrifying, Beata couldn't move. Marie pulled at the grass, trying to drag herself away from the men, toward Beata. Her lips moved, but no words came out, just low, hoarse grunts. Her fingers lost their power. She slumped, twitching like a freshly butchered sheep. Up on the Domini Dirch, both Estelle and Emmeline screamed. Beata pulled free her sword, holding it aloft for all to see. "Soldiers! Attack!" Beata checked the men. They were still coming. They were grinning. And then the world turned truly mad. Chapter 64. Norris rushed forward, like they'd been trained, going for the legs of one man. The man kicked Norris in the face. Norris fell back, holding his face, blood running out through his fingers. The man picked up Norris's fallen sword and plunged it through his gut, pinning Norris to the ground, leaving him to squirm in screaming agony. to shred his fingers on the sharp blade. Carl and Bryce were rushing in with weapons drawn. Kareen charged out of the barracks with a spear. Annette was right behind her with another. Beata felt a surge of conviction. The men were going to be surrounded. Her soldiers were trained for combat. They could handle 3 men. "Sergeant," the woman in red called, "get back!" Beata was terrified, but she still felt annoyed by the woman, who obviously didn't know the first thing about soldiering. Beata was also ashamed for the woman's cowardice. Beata and her soldiers would stand and fight. They would protect the worthless woman in red, who feared to stand up to a mere 3 of the enemy. Fitch, too, Beata was proud to note, rushed forward with his prize sword, ready to fight. As they all rushed in, only the man who had cut down Marie even had his sword out. The other 2 still had their weapons sheathed. She was furious that they would take Beata's squad so lightly. Beata, better accustomed to stabbing meat with a blade than were the rest of her squad, confidently went for a man. She didn't see how, but he effortlessly dodged her. Startled, she realized that this was not at all like stabbing straw men, or carcasses hanging from a hook. As Beata's blade caught only air, Annette rushed up to stab him in the leg from behind. He sidestepped Annette too, but caught her by her red hair. He pulled a knife, and in an easy, slow manner, as he smiled wickedly into Beata's eyes, slit Annette's throat as if he were butchering a hog. Another man caught Kareen's spear, snapped it in half with one hand, and rammed the barbed point in her gut. Carl swung his sword low at the man Beata missed, trying to hamstring him, and got his face kicked instead. The man swung his sword down at Carl. Beata sprang forward and blocked his strike. The power of the ringing blow of steel against steel hammered her weapon from her hand. Her hand stung so much she couldn't flex her unfeeling fingers. She realized she was on her knees. The man swung down on Carl. Carl held his hands up protectively before his face. The sword severed his hands at mid-palm before it split his face to his chin. The man turned back to Beata. His blood-slicked sword was coming for her face next. Seeing it coming, Beata could do nothing but scream. A hand snatched her hair and violently yanked her back. The sword tip whistled right past her face, hitting the ground between her legs. It was the woman in red who had just saved Beata's life. The man's attention was caught by something else. He turned to look. Beata looked too, and saw riders coming, maybe as many as 100. More special Anderith guards, just like these 3. The woman in red pulled Bryce back just before he was killed. As soon as she turned to something else, he rushed back at the enemy despite her orders to stay back. Beata saw a sword, the blade red, erupt from the middle of Bryce's back, lifting him from his feet. The big man who had hacked Carl now turned his attention back to Beata. She tried to scurry back, but his long stride was faster. In her panic, she couldn't get her feet. Beata knew she was going to die. As the sword swung down on her, she couldn't think what to do. She began a prayer she knew she wouldn't get a chance to finish. Fitch leaped in front of her, his sword blocking the killing blow. The enemy's blade shattered on Fitch's weapon. Beata blinked in surprise. She was still alive. Fitch took a fierce swing at the man. He sidestepped, Fitch's blade just missing his middle as he arched his back. With icy efficiency as the blade was going by him, the man casually unhooked a spiked mace from a hanger on his weapons belt. As Fitch was still whipping around with the momentum, the man took a swift, powerful, backhanded swing. The blow tore off the top of Fitch's skull. Pink chunks of his brain splattered up Beata's tunic. Fitch crumbled to the ground. Beata sat frozen in shock. She could hear her own cries, like a panicked child. She couldn't make herself stop. It was like she was watching someone else. Instead of killing her, the man turned his consideration to Fitch, or rather Fitch's sword. He pulled the gleaming weapon from Fitch's limp hand and then yanked the baldric and scabbard free of the dead weight of the body. More mounted men were just arriving as the man slid the sword of truth back into the scabbard. He smiled and winked at Beata. "I think Commander Stein would like to have this. What do you think?" Beata sat stunned. Fitch's body right in front of her, his brains all over her, his blood emptying out on the ground. "Why?" was all Beata could say. The man was still grinning. "Now that you all had your chance to vote, Emperor Jagang is casting the deciding ballot." "What you got here?" another man called as he dismounted.
"Some decent-looking girls."
"Well, don't kill 'em all," the man complained good-naturedly.
I like mine warm and still moving. The men all laughed. Beata whimpered as she pushed with her heels, scooting away from the men. This sword is something I've heard of. I'm taking it to Commander Stein. He'll be pleased no end to be able to present it to the Emperor. Over her shoulder, she saw another man up on the Domini Dirch casually disarm Estelle and Emmeline as they tried to defend their post. Emmeline leaped from the Domini Dirch to escape. The fall broke her leg. A man on the ground grabbed her red hair in his fist and started dragging her toward the barracks as if he had caught a chicken. Estelle was getting kissed by the man up on the Domini Dirch as she beat her fists against him. The men thought her battling comical. Men in dark leather plates and belts and straps covered with spikes and chainmail and fur and with massive swords, flails, and axes were dismounting everywhere. Others, still on their horses, were racing around and around the Domini Dirch, cheering. When the men all turned to Emmeline's renewed screams of pain and terror, and to her captors laughing, a hand snatched Beata's collar and dragged her back on her bottom. The woman in red leather behind her growled under her teeth, "Move while you still can." Beata, powered by panic, scrambled up and ran with the woman while the men weren't looking. The two of them dove into a dip in the ground, hidden by the tall grass. "Stop that crying," the woman ordered. "Stop it, or you'll get us caught." Beata forced herself to stop making noise, but she couldn't stop the tears. Her whole squad had just been killed, except Estelle and Emmeline, and they were captured. Fitch. That fool, Fitch, had just gotten himself killed, saving her life. "If you don't hush, I'll slit your throat myself." Beata bit her lip. She had always been able to keep herself from crying. It had never been this hard. "I'm sorry," Beata whispered in a whine. "I just saved your fat from the fire. In return, you can at least not get us caught." The woman watched as the man with the sword of truth galloped away, back toward Fairfield. She cursed under her breath. "Why'd you just drag me away?" Beata asked in bitter anger. "Why didn't you at least try to get some of them?" The woman flicked out a hand. "Who do you think did that? Who do you think was protecting your back? One of your children's soldiers?" Beata looked then and saw what she hadn't seen before. Dead enemy soldiers sprawled here and there. She looked back at the woman's blue eyes. "Idiot," the woman muttered. "You act like this is my fault, like you hate me." "Because you are a fool." She pointed angrily out at the carnage. 3 men just wiped out your post and they aren't even breathing hard. "But they surprised us." "You think this some game? You're not even smart enough to realize you're nothing more than a dupe. Those in charge puffed you up with false courage and sent you out to fail. It's plain as day and you can't even see it. 100 of you girls and boys couldn't knock down one of those men. Those are Imperial Order troops." "But if they just..." "You think the enemy is going to play by your rules? Real life just got those other young people killed, and the dead girls are going to be better off than the ones still alive, I can promise you that." Beata was so horrified she couldn't speak. The woman's heated voice softened a little. "Well, it's not all your fault. I guess you aren't old enough to know better, to know some of life's realities. You can't be expected to see what's true and not. You only think you can." "Why do you want that sword so bad?" "Because it belongs to Lord Rahl. He sent me to get it." "Why'd you save me?" The woman stared back at her. Behind those cold, calculating blue eyes, there didn't seem to be any fear. "I guess because I, too, was once a foolish young girl captured by bad men." "What do they do to you?" The woman smiled a grim smile. "They made me into what I am, Mord Sith. You wouldn't be that lucky. These men aren't anywhere near as good at what they do." Beata had never heard of a Mord Sith before. Their attention was drawn to Estelle's cries from up on the Domini Dirch. "I need to go after the sword. I suggest you run." "Take me with you." "No. You cannot be of any use and will only hold me back." Beata knew the awful truth of that. "What am I to do?" "You get your behind out of here before those men get a hold of it, or you'll be very much more than sorry." "Please," Beata said, tears welling up again. "Help me save Estelle and Emmeline." The woman pressed her lips tight as she considered a moment. "That one," the woman finally said, with cold reckoning pointing at Estelle. "As I'm leaving, I'll help you get that one. Then it's up to you two to get away."
Beata saw the man laughing, groping Estelle's breasts as she tried to fight him. Beata knew what that was like.
But we have to get Emmeline too.
She gestured off toward the barracks where they dragged her.
That one has a broken leg. You can't take her. She'll get you caught.
But she's...
Forget her. What are you going to do, carry her? Stop being a fool, child. Think. Do you want to try to get away with that one? Or do you want to get yourself captured for sure, going after both? I'm in a hurry. Decide.
Beata struggled to breathe, wishing she couldn't hear the screams coming from the barracks. She didn't want to find herself in there with those men. She already had a taste of one of them.
The one, then. Let's go,
Beata said with finality.
Good for you, child.
The woman was deliberately calling her that, Beata knew, to put her in her place, hoping it would keep her in line and save her life. Now listen and do exactly what I say. I'm not sure you'll make it, but it's your only chance. Desperate to escape the nightmare, Beata nodded. I'm going to go up there and take out that man. I'll see to it you have at least 2 horses. I'll send the girl down while you grab the horses. Get her up on the horse with you, and then head out there, and don't stop for anything. The woman was pointing out past the Domini Dirch, out to the wilds. You just keep going, away from Anderith, to some other place in the Midlands. Page 466.
How are you going to keep them from getting us?
Who said I was? You just get the horses, and then you two run for your lives. All I can do is try to give you a lead.
The woman held a finger before Beata's face.
If for any reason she doesn't make it down the steps or get on the horse, you leave her and run.
Beata, numb from terror, nodded. She just wanted to get away. She didn't care about anything else anymore. She just wanted to escape with her life. Beata clutched the red leather sleeve.
I'm Beata.
Good for you. Let's go. The woman sprang up, running in a crouch. Beata followed after her, imitating her low run. The woman came up behind a soldier standing in her way and knocked his feet out from behind. As soon as he crashed to his back, before he could call out, she dropped on him, crushing his windpipe with a blow from her elbow. 2 more quick blows silenced him.
How did you do that?
Beata asked, dumbfounded. She pushed Beata down in a thick clump of grass by the man.
Years of training in how to kill. It's my profession.
She checked the Domini Dirch again.
Wait here until the count of 10, then follow. Don't count fast.
Without waiting for Beata's answer, she sprang into a dead run. Some men watched, confused by what was going on, since she wasn't trying to escape, but heading right for the center of all the men. The woman dodged between all the horses racing around the Domini Dirch, their riders hooting and hollering. The man next to Beata was burbling blood from his crushed nose, maybe drowning in it as he lay there on his back. The man holding Estelle turned. The woman in red yanked the striker from the holder, tearing it away from the restraints. The restraints added momentum as they broke. When the striker clouted the man in the head, Beata could hear it crack his skull from where she stood as she finally reached the count of 10. He toppled backward over the rail and fell beneath the hooves of running horses. In the grip of terror, Beata jumped up and started running. The woman, with a mighty swing, brought the striker around, slamming the Domini Dirch. The world shook with the dull drone of the weapon going off. The sound was overpowering, like it might shimmy her teeth out of their sockets and vibrate Beata's skull apart. The men on horseback out front screamed. Their horses screamed. The cries ended abruptly as man and beast alike came apart in a bloody blast. Men still running round the Domini Dirch couldn't stop in time. They skidded or tumbled past the line to their death. Beata ran for all she was worth, even as she felt her joints might come apart from the terrible chime of the Domini Dirch. Wielding the striker, the woman whacked men off their horses. She seized Estelle by her arm and practically threw her down the steps as Beata gathered the reins to 2 frightened animals. The men were in a state of confused panic. They didn't know what would happen with the weapon, if it would chime again and in turn kill them too. Beata snatched a confused, terrified Estelle by the arm. The woman in red leaped from the railing onto the back of a man still mounted. The woman still had the broken neck of the black bottle. She gripped the man around the middle and ground the broken bottle into his eyes. He fell screaming from his horse. She scooted forward into the saddle and snatched up the reins. She reached the tired animal she had arrived on, grabbed her saddlebags, and with a cry of fury, urged her horse into a dead run toward Fairfield. Up! Beata screamed to a dazed and bewildered Estelle. Thankfully, the Ander woman understood her chance to escape and seized it as Beata, too, scrambled atop a horse. Both animals wheeled all about in the confusion. Men went charging off after the woman in red leather. Beata was no horsewoman, but she knew what she must do. She thumped her heels against the animal's ribs. Estelle did the same. The two of them, one Haken, one Ander, ran for their lives. "Where are we going, Sergeant?" Estelle cried out. Beata didn't even know what direction she was running. She was just running. She wanted the uniform off. It was just another cruel joke played on her by Bertrand Chanbour. "I'm not a sergeant," Beata yelled back, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just Beata, a fool, same as you, Estelle." She wished she had thanked the woman in red for saving their lives. Chapter 65. Dalton glanced up to see Hildemara gliding into his new office. She was wearing a revealing dress of a gold-colored satin with white trim, as if anyone would be interested in what she had to reveal. He rose behind his new expansive desk, the like of which he had never imagined would be his. "Hildemara, what a pleasure to have you stop in for a visit." She smiled as she peered at him like a hound eyeing a meal. She ambled around his desk to stand close beside him, leaning her bottom against the desk's edge so she could face him intimately. "Dalton, you look marvelous in that outfit." "New?" "Must be," she said, running a finger down the embroidered sleeve. "You look good in his office, too. Better than my worthless husband ever looked. You bring it some class." "Thank you, Hildemara. I must say you look ravishing yourself." Her smile widened. With true pleasure or in mockery, he wasn't sure. She had not been shy about expressing her admiration for him since the old sovereign unexpectedly passed on. On the other hand, he knew her well enough not to be lulled into turning his back on her, in a manner of speaking. He wasn't able to decide if she was being warm and friendly, or if she hid an executioner's axe behind her back. Either way, he was on guard. "The vote is counted from the city, and beginning to come in from the returning soldiers." Now he thought he knew the reason for her smile, and the results of the people's say. Still, one could never be certain of such things. "And how are the good people of Anderith responding to Lord Ral's invitation to join with him?" "I'm afraid Lord Ral is no match for you, Dalton." A tentative smile began to work its way up onto his face. "Really? How convincing is it? If it isn't a resounding rejection, Lord Ral may feel he has cause to press his case." She shrugged in a teasing manner. "The people of the city, of course, are reluctant to believe Lord Ral. 7 of 10 gave him an X." Dalton tipped his head up, closed his eyes, and let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Hildemara," he said with a grin. "And the rest?" "Just starting to come in. It will take the soldiers a time to ride back." "But so far? How goes it so far?" She dragged a finger around on the desktop. "Surprising." That confused him. "Surprising? How so?" She turned a beaming smile up at him. "The worst for us is only 3 in 4 votes our way. Some places have had as many as 8 and 9 in 10, giving Lord Ral an X." Dalton put a hand to his chest as he let out another sigh of relief. "I thought as much. But one can never know for sure in such things." "Simply amazing, Dalton. You are a wonder." She turned her palms up. "And you didn't even have to cheat. Imagine that." Dalton made 2 fists of excitement. "Thank you, Hildemara. Thank you for bringing me the news. If you'll excuse me, I must go straight away and tell Teresa. I've been so busy, I've hardly seen her for weeks. She'll be so glad to hear the news." He started to move, but Hildemara put a restraining finger to his chest. Her smile had that deadly edge to it again. "Teresa already knows, I'm sure." Dalton frowned. "Who would have told her before I was told?" "Bertrand told her, I'm sure." "Bertrand? What would he be doing telling Teresa news like this?" Hildemara made a little simper. "Oh, you know how Bertrand talks when he's between the legs of a woman he finds thrilling." Dalton froze. Alarm bells chimed in his head as he began recalling all the times he had been absent from Teresa since Bertrand had been named sovereign. recalling how taken Teresa was with the figure of sovereign. He recalled how she had spent the night up in prayer after meeting the old sovereign. He recalled her awe at Bertrand becoming sovereign. He made himself stop speculating in such a fashion. Such speculation was an insidious enemy that could eat you away from inside. Hildemara, knowing how busy he had been, was probably just hoping to give him a fright or cause trouble. That would be like her. That isn't the least bit amusing, Hildemara. Propping one hand on the desk, she leaned toward him and ran a finger of the other hand down his jaw. Not meant to be. Dalton stood silent, carefully trying to keep from making the wrong move before he knew what was really going on. This could still be a foolish trick of hers, just to make him angry at Tess, thinking it would somehow drive him into her own arms. Or it could be nothing more than news she misunderstood. He knew, though, that Hildemara was not likely to get news like this wrong. She had her own sources, and they were as reliable as Dalton's. Hildemara, I don't think you should be repeating slanderous rumors. Not a rumor, my dear Dalton, a fact. I've seen your good wife coming from his room. You know Teresa, she likes to pray. I've overheard Bertrand brag to Stein about having her. Dalton nearly staggered back. What? The smirk spread in deadly perfection. Apparently, from what Bertrand tells Stein, she is quite the unrestrained courtesan, and enjoys being a very bad little girl in his bed. Dalton felt the blood go to his face in a hot rush. He considered killing Hildemara where she stood. As his finger touched the hilt of his sword, he considered it very seriously. Finally, instead, he kept himself under control, although he could feel his knees trembling. I just thought you should know, Dalton, she added. I found it quite sad. My husband is humping your wife, and you don't know anything about it. It could be awkward. You could inadvertently embarrass yourself not knowing. Why, Hildemara? He managed to ask in a whisper. Why would you get so much satisfaction from this? At last her smile bloomed into true pleasure. Because I always hated your smug superiority about your vows of fidelity. The way you looked down your nose, believing yourself and your wife better than all the rest of us. By sheer force of will, Dalton restrained himself. In times of trial or exigency, he was always able to become analytical in order to apply the best solution to the situation that confronted him. With ruthless resolve, he did that now. Thank you for the information, Hildemara. It could indeed have been embarrassing. Do me a favor and don't go all gloomy about it, Dalton. You have reason to be enormously pleased. This is the sovereign we're talking about. It is, after all, an honor for any man to provide his wife for as reverend and sublime a figure as the sovereign of Anderith. You will be loved and respected all the more because your wife is giving the sovereign release from the stresses of his high calling. You should know that, Dalton. After all, you made the man who he is, the Creator's advisor in this world. Your wife is simply being a loyal subject. She chuckled. Very loyal, from what I've overheard. My, but it would take quite the woman to match her. She leaned close and kissed his ear. But I'd like to try, Dalton, dear. She looked him in the eye as she straightened. I've always been fascinated by you. You are the most devious, dangerous man I've ever met. And I've met some real pieces of work. She turned back from the doorway. After you come to accept it, you will find it of no importance, Dalton. You'll see. And then, as you suggested to me before, once your vow was broken, I will be the first you come to. Don't forget, you promised. Dalton stood alone in his office, his mind racing, thinking on what he should do. Kaelin laid her arms on his shoulders and leaned over, putting her cheek against his ear. It felt warm and comforting, despite the unneeded distraction. She kissed his temple. How is it going? Richard stretched with a yawn. Where did one begin? This man was bent seriously out of straight. What do you mean? I still have a lot to translate, but I'm beginning to get a picture of what happened. Richard rubbed his eyes. The man is sent here to banish the chimes. He at once scrutinizes the problem, and sees a simple solution. The wizards at the keep thought it was inspired genius and told him so.
He must have been proud, she said,
Clearly meaning the opposite. He understood her sardonic tone and shared the sentiment. You're right, not Joseph Ander. He doesn't say it here, but from what we've read before, I know the way he thinks. Joseph Ander would have felt not pride in himself for understanding it, but contempt for those who had failed to.
So, she said, he had the solution. Then what?
They told him to see to it at once. Apparently they were having problems similar to ours with the chimes and wanted the threat ended immediately. He complained that if they had the good sense to send him to see to it, then they should stop telling him what to do.
Not a good way to treat his superiors at the keep.
They implored him to stop the chimes because of the people dying. Apparently they knew him well enough to realize they had better not threaten the man, at least not with the rest of the war to worry about. So they told him to use his best judgment, but to please hurry with the solution so people would be safe from the threat. He was much more pleased to get such a message, but used it as a club to start lecturing the wizards at the keep.
About what?
Richard ran his fingers back into his hair. It was frustrating to try to put into words what Joseph Ander was about. There's a lot left in here to translate. It's slow going. But I don't think this book is going to tell us how to banish the chimes. Joseph Ander just doesn't think that way. To write it down. Kaylin straightened and turned around with her back to the table so she could stand facing him. She folded her arms.
All right, Richard. I know you better than that. What aren't you telling me?
Richard stood and turned his back to her as he pressed his fingers to his temple.
Richard, don't you trust me?
He turned to her. He took up her hand. No, it isn't that. It's just that some of the things he says, I don't know where truth leaves off and Joseph Ander's madness begins. This goes beyond anything I've ever heard about, been taught, or believed about magic. Now she did look concerned. He guessed in one way he was raising her fears wrongly. On the other hand, he couldn't begin to raise them to the levels of his own fears. Joseph Ander, he began, thought he was just better than the other wizards.
We already knew that.
Yes, but he may have been right.
What?
Sometimes in madness resides genius. Kaylin, I don't know where to draw the line. In one way, not knowing about magic is a liability, but in another, it means I'm not burdened by preconceived notions, the way the wizards at the keep were, so I might recognize the truth in his words where they did not. You see, Joseph Ander viewed magic not so much as a set of requirements, a pinch of this word 3 times while turning around on your left foot and all that kind of thing. He saw magic as an art form, a means of expression.
Kaylin was frowning. I don't follow. Either you cast a spell properly to invoke it, or it doesn't work. Like I call my power with a touch. Like the way we call the chimes by fulfilling specific requirements of the magic, thereby releasing it.
He knew that with her magical ability, her background, and her learning about magic, she would have the same problem the other wizards did. Richard felt just a trace of the frustration Joseph Ander must have felt. In that, too, he understood the man that much better. Understood a tiny bit of the frustration of having people tell you the hard facts of something when you knew better, yet couldn't get them to see the abstract concept of the greater whole right before them. As did Joseph Ander, Richard thought to try again. Yes, I know, and I'm not saying that doesn't work, but he believed there was more, that magic could be taken to a higher level, to a plane beyond that which most people with the gift used. Now she really was frowning.
Richard, that's madness.
No, I don't think so. He picked up the journey book. This is in answer to something unrelated, they asked, but you have to hear this to understand the way Joseph Ander thinks. He read to her the crux of the translation. A wizard who cannot truly destroy cannot truly create. Richard tapped the book. He was talking about a wizard like the gifted now, a wizard with only the additive, like Zed. Ander didn't even consider a man to have the gift if he didn't have both sides. He thought of such a man as simply an aberration, and hopelessly disadvantaged. Richard went back to the journey book and read on. A wizard must know himself, or he risks working ill magic that harms his own free will. That's him talking about the creative aspects of magic beyond the structure of it. Magic intensifies and concentrates passions, strengthening not only such things as joy, but ruinous passions too. And in this way, they may become obsessions and unbearable unless released.
Sounds like he's trying to justify being destructive, she said.
I don't think so. I think he's on to something important, a higher balance, as it were. Kaylin shook her head, clearly not catching what he saw, but he could think of no way to get it across to her, so he read on. This is important. Imagination is what makes a great wizard, for with it, he is able to transcend the limitations of tradition and go beyond the structure of what now exists into the higher realm of creating the very fabric of magic.
That's what you were talking about? About him thinking of it as an art form? A means of expression? Like he's the creator himself, weaving a cloth of magic out of nothing?
Exactly. But listen to this. This, I believe, may be the most important thing Joseph Ander has to say. When the chimes ceased being a problem, the other wizards cautiously asked what he did. You can almost read the anxiety in their words. This is his terse reply to their question of what he had done to the chimes. A grace might rise in obedience to an inventive spell. Kaylin rubbed her arms, clearly disturbed by the answer.
Dear spirits, what does that mean?
Richard leaned closer to her. I think it means he dreamed up something. A new magic, outside the parameters of the original conjuring that brought the chimes into this world. Magic to suit the situation and himself. In other words, Joseph Ander got creative. Kaylin's green eyes cast about. He knew she was considering the depths of aberration with which they were dealing. This was the madman who had finally inflicted the chimes on them.
The world is coming apart, she whispered to herself. And you're talking about Joseph Ander using magic as an art form?
I'm just telling you what the man said. Richard turned to the last page. I skipped ahead. I wanted to see the last thing he wrote the wizards. Richard studied the High Daharan words again to be certain of the translation, and then read Joseph Ander's words. In the end, I have concluded I must reject the Creator and the Keeper both. I instead create my own solution, my own rebirth and death, and in so doing will always protect my people. And so farewell, for I shall lay my soul on troubled waters, and thus watch over for all time that which I have so carefully wrought, and which is now safeguarded and inviolate. Richard looked up. See? Do you understand? He saw she didn't. Kaylin, I don't think he banished the chimes as he was supposed to. I think he instead used them for his own purposes. Her nose wrinkled.
Used them? What can you use the chimes for?
The Domini Dirch.
What?
She squeezed the bridge of her nose between her finger and thumb.
But then how is it possible for us to follow such a well-defined, prescribed, strict outline and inadvertently call them forth? That sort of structure is exactly what you were telling me Joseph Ander thought he was beyond.
Richard had been waiting for that exact argument. That's the balance. Don't you see? Magic must be balanced. In order to do something creative, he had to balance it with something not creative, a very strict formula. That it is so strict in its requirements to free the chimes is in itself proof of the creativity of what he did. He knew her well enough to tell she didn't agree, but wasn't in the mood to argue. She said simply,
So, how do we then banish the chimes?
Richard shook his head with defeat in that much of it. I don't know. I fear there is no answer to that question. The wizards of Joseph Ander's time were equally frustrated by the man. In the end, they simply considered this place lost to them. I'm beginning to believe Joseph Ander created an unbreakable magic inside a puzzle without a solution. Kaylin took the book from his hands, closed it, and placed it back on the little table.
Richard, I think you're getting a little crazy yourself, reading the rantings of a lunatic. That's not the way magic works.
That's what the wizards at the keep had told Ander, that he couldn't convert and control an element that was innately uncontrollable. Richard didn't tell Kaylin that, though. She wasn't prepared to think of magic in these terms. Neither were the other wizards. Joseph Ander had not been at all pleased to have his ideas so summarily dismissed, thus his final farewell. Kaylin put her arms around his neck.
I'm sorry. I know you're trying your best. I'm just getting nervous. The vote should be coming back soon.
Richard put his hands on her waist. Kaylin, people will see the truth. They have to. She gazed off.
Richard, she whispered, make love to me?
What? She looked up into his eyes.
It's been so long. Make love to me.
Here? Now?
We can tie the tent shut. No one comes in without asking permission anyway.
She smiled.
I promise to be quiet and not to embarrass you.
With a finger she lifted his chin.
I promise I won't even tell your other wife.
That brought a brief smile, but Richard wasn't able to keep hold of it. Kaylin, we can't.
Well, I think I could. I bet I could change your mind, too.
Richard lifted the small dark stone on her necklace. Kaylin, magic has failed. This won't work.
I know. That's why I want to.
She clutched at his shirt.
Richard, I don't care. What if we make a baby? So what?
You know so what.
Richard, would it be so bad? Really?
Her green eyes were filling with tears.
Would it be so bad if we made a child together?
No, of course not, Kaylin. It isn't that. You know I want to, but we can't right now. We can't afford to see Shota in every shadow, waiting to do as she promised. We can't afford the distraction from our duty.
Our duty? What about us? What about what we want?
Richard turned away. Kaylin, do you really want to bring a child into this world? Do you want to bring a child into the madness of this world? The madness of the chimes and a horrific war looming before us?
What if I said yes?
He turned back to her and smiled. He could see he was only upsetting her. Du Shailu being pregnant was probably making Kaylin think of having her own child. Kaylin, I want to if you do, all right? Whenever you want, we will. And I'll deal with Shota. But in the meantime, could we wait until we see if there is even going to be a world of life? Or even a world with freedom, into which we can bring our child? She finally smiled.
Of course. You're right, Richard. I guess I was just getting carried away. We have the chimes to deal with, and the Imperial Order.
Richard took her in his arms to comfort her, when Captain Myford called from outside the tent. See, he whispered to her. She smiled. Yes, Captain, come on in. The man stepped inside reluctantly. He wouldn't meet Richard's gaze. What is it, Captain?
Lord Rahl, Mother Confessor. The vote in Fairfield is counted. Some of our men have returned with numbers, but not all of them, he was quick to add. There are more yet to come back. It will take a few days yet before they all travel back.
So, Captain, what are the results? The man handed over a slip of paper. Richard read it, but it took a moment for it to sink in. 7 in 10 against us, he whispered. Kaylin gently lifted the paper from his fingers and looked at it. Without a word, she set it on the table. All right, he said. We know they were telling all those lies in the city. We just have to realize it will be different out around the land.
Richard, Kaylin whispered, they will spread the same lies around the land.
But we talked to those people. We spent time with them. Richard turned to Captain Myford. What about the outlying places? Will, what about that place? Richard snapped his fingers. Westbrook, where we spent time looking at Joseph Anders' things. What about Westbrook? Is the vote back from there? The man had backed away a step. Yes, Lord Rahl. And what is it then? Kaylin put a hand on his arm.
Richard, she whispered, the captain is on our side.
Richard pressed his fingers to his temples as he took a breath. What is the vote from Westbrook, Captain? The man, having lost much of his color, cleared his throat. 9 of 10 marked an X against us, Lord Rahl. Richard stood stunned. He had talked to those people. He remembered some of their names, their beautiful children. Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet, and he was falling through insanity. He had been up day and night trying to help these people have their own way over their lives, have freedom, and they rejected it.
Richard, Kaylin said in soft sympathy, it was nothing you did. They told those people lies. They frightened the people.
Richard lifted a hand in a vague manner. But I talked to them, explained to them that this was for them, for their future, for the freedom of their children.
I know, Richard.
Captain Meifert stood awkwardly. Kalen signaled with a hand, dismissing him. He bowed and quietly backed out of the tent. "I'm going for a walk," Richard whispered. "I need to be alone." He waved toward the blankets. "Just go on to bed without me." Richard walked alone into the darkness. Chapter 66. He quietly dismissed for the evening the woman dusting all the elaborate woodwork, and, after closing the door behind her, went to the bedroom. Teresa turned when she heard him come in. "Dalton," she smiled. "There you are, sweetheart." "Tess?" He had run the entire state of affairs through his mind 1,000 times, and had finally come to the place where he could face Tess and know he would be able to control his response. He had to control himself. He had retreated into his most trusted method of handling things. Only there could he be sure of his control. He was going to handle this, just as he handled so many other things. "I didn't expect to see you in so early." "Tess, I heard something." She sat at the mirror, brushing her beautiful hair. "Really? Some interesting news?" "A bit. I heard you have been occupying the bed of the Sovereign. Is this true?" He knew now it was. He had pulled every thread of his cobweb. She stopped brushing and looked at him in the mirror, her face a mix of emotions. Defiance predominated them. "Dalton, it's not like he's another man. It's the Sovereign." She stood and turned to him, unsure how he was going to react. "He is next to the Creator." "May I ask how this came about?" "Bertrand said the Creator spoke to him." She stared off to a distant place. "The Creator told Bertrand that because I had been faithful to you and had never been with another man, and because you had been faithful to me, the Creator had chosen me to be the one to release Bertrand's worldly tensions." Her eyes focused on him again. "So you see, it's a reward for you, too, Dalton, for your faithfulness to me." Dalton made himself answer, "Yes, I can see that." "Bertrand says it is my holy duty." "Holy duty." "When I'm with him, it's like, I don't know, it's so special. To help the Sovereign in this world is an honor as well as a duty. To think I help relieve him of the awful tension that builds up in him from being Sovereign. It's an awesome responsibility, Dalton, being Sovereign." Dalton nodded. "You're right." Seeing that he wasn't going to get angry and harm her, she stepped closer. "Dalton, I still love you just the same." "I'm glad to hear it, Tess. That was what I'm most worried about. I fear I've lost your love." She grasped his shoulders. "No, silly. Never. I still love you the same, but the Sovereign has called upon me. You have to understand that. He needs me." Dalton swallowed. "Of course, darling. But we can still be together in bed." "Oh, Dalton, of course we can. Is that what you were worried about? That I'd not have time for you, too? Dalton, I love you and will always want you." "Good," he nodded. "That's good." "Come to bed, sweetheart, and I'll show you. You might even find me more exciting now. And Dalton, it's a high honor to be with the Sovereign. Everyone will only think more of you." "I'm sure you're right." "Come to bed, then." She kissed his cheek. "Let me show you how happy I can make you." Dalton scratched his forehead. I would love nothing better, really I would, but I have a whole pile of urgent work. The vote just came in." "I know. Bertrand told me." "Bertrand?" She nodded. "The Sovereign, silly, he told me. I'm so proud of you, Dalton. I know you had a part in it. It wasn't all just Bertrand's work. I know you had a hand in helping him win." "A part?" "It's kind of the Sovereign to take note of my contribution. He speaks very highly of you, Dalton." "I'm pleased to hear that." Dalton cleared his throat. Look, Tess, I've got to get to my work. I have urgent matters." "Should I wait up?" Dalton waved a hand. No, darling, I have to make a trip into Fairfield to see to some matters." "Tonight? Yet tonight?" "Yes." "Dalton, you mustn't work so hard. Promise me you will take some time for yourself. Promise me. I worry for you." "You shouldn't. I'm fine." She smiled her most intimate smile. "Promise me you will make time to make love to me?" Dalton smiled. "Of course. I promise." He kissed her cheek. "Good night, darling." The woman holding out the vial frowned. "Do I know you?" "No," Kaelin said, turning her face down so it would be shadowed by the lamplight. "I don't see how. I'm from far away. I only came into Fairfield for this." Kaelin wore common clothes she used for traveling, and a head wrap made of a scarf so her long hair would be hidden. She put on the head wrap after she was away from their camp. With Richard off somewhere, the soldiers insisted on escorting her on her walk to get some air. She had gruffly ordered them to leave her alone and go back to their posts. Such orders would never have worked with Kara. Kara would have ignored them. The soldiers were not as fearless or as reckless or as smart as Kara. The woman sighed. "Well, I understand, my dear. A number of women have made a journey for such as this." She held out the stoppered vial, clearly expecting payment first. Kaelin passed her a gold sovereign. "Keep it all. I expect your silence in return." The woman bowed her head. "I quite understand. Thank you, my dear. Very generous of you. Thank you." Kaelin took the vial, holding it nestled in her palm, staring through its clouded glass at the clear liquid inside. She realized her other hand was on her belly. She let the arm drop to her side. "Now," the woman said, pointing at the poorly made glass vial, "it will remain good for the night, since I just mixed it for you. You can take it whenever you please, but if you wait until morning it will likely not still be potent enough. I'd suggest you do it tonight, before you go to bed." "Will it hurt?" The woman's face frowned with concern. "Likely not more than a regular cycle, my dear, not with it being this early. There will just be the bleeding, so be prepared for that." Kaelin had meant would it hurt the baby. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the question. "Just drink it all down," the woman went on. "It isn't so bad to taste, but you might want some tea with it." "Thank you." Kaelin turned to the door. "Wait," said the woman. She came up close and took Kaelin's hand. "I'm sorry, my dear. You're plenty young. You can have another." A thought struck her. "This won't impair my ability." No, dear. Not at all. You'll be fine." "Thank you," Kaelin said, as she stepped toward the door, suddenly eager to be out of the little home, out into the darkness and alone, in case she had to cry. The woman snatched Kaelin's arm and turned her around. "I don't usually lecture young women because by the time they come to me, the time for lecturing is long past. But I hope you get yourself married, dear. I help when I'm needed, but I'd rather help you deliver your baby than shed it. I really would." Kaelin nodded. "I feel the same. Thank you." The streets of Fairfield were dark, but there were still people going about their business. Kaelin knew that when the imperial order came, the business of their lives would be soon turned inside out. At that moment, though, she had trouble caring. She decided she would do it before she got back. She feared Richard finding the vial and having to explain it to him. Richard would never let her do this, but since he didn't know about her condition, she had been able to get his true feelings and wishes. He was right. They had the rest of the people to worry about. They couldn't let their personal problem bring harm to everyone. Shota would keep her word about such a thing, and then they wouldn't be able to see to their duty. This would be best. On the way out of the city, she saw Dalton Campbell coming up the street on horseback, so she turned down a dark street. He always seemed to be a man of careful thought. As he rode by, Kaelin thought he looked as if he was in another world. She wondered what he was doing in a part of the city that had a reputation for ill repute. She waited until he passed before she went on her way. As she reached the road back to the minister's estate, where their men were camped, she saw the glint of moonlight off the top rail of a carriage in the far distance. It would be some time before the plodding carriage reached her, but she turned off the road just the same. She didn't want to meet anyone along the road, especially someone who might recognize her. The lump in her throat was near to choking her as she walked into the field of wheat. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Off the road a ways, she finally sank to her knees, giving in to the tears. As she stared at the vial resting in her palm, moonlight reflecting off the wavy glass, she couldn't recall ever feeling much lower in her life. She sobbed back a cry, stifling her weeping, reminding herself this was for the good of everyone. It was. She was sure of it. She pulled the stopper, letting it fall from her fingers. She held the vial up, trying to see it in the watery moonlight. She pressed her other hand over their child, her child, Richard's child. Swallowing back the tears, she put the vial to her lips. She paused, waiting until she could get control of her breathing. She didn't want to empty it into her mouth and then not be able to swallow. Kaelin pulled it away from her lips. She stared at it in the moonlight again and thought of everything this meant. And then she turned it over, emptying the liquid out on the ground. Immediately she felt a wave of relief, as if her life had been spared and hope had returned to the world. When she stood, the tears were a distant memory, already drying on her cheeks. Kaelin smiled with relief, with joy. Their child was safe. She threw the empty vial out into the field. When she did so, Kaelin saw a man standing out in the wheat, watching her. She froze. He started toward her, purposefully, quickly. Kaelin looked to the side and saw other men coming. Behind, yet more were closing on her. Young men she saw, all with red hair. Not waiting an instant for the situation to get any worse, she reacted instinctively and broke into a dead run toward their camp. Rather than trying to go between the men, she headed directly toward one. He hunkered down, feet spread, arms out, waiting. Kaelin raced up to him and seized his arm. She looked into his eyes, recognizing him as a messenger named Rowley. Without effort of thought, and in that instant, she released her power into him, bracing for the jolt that would take him. The same instant nothing happened, she realized it was because the chimes had caused her magic to fail. She thought she felt it within her as always, but it was gone. In that same instant of realization, recognition, and failure, she suddenly did feel magic. Kaelin knew the tingling invasion of magic overpowering in its onrushing surge, snaking into her like a viper down a hole, and just as deadly. She jerked her arm back, but too late, she knew. Men closed in from both sides, less concerned now that they had her. Men behind were still running toward them. Only an instant had passed since she first grabbed Rowley and let him go. In that time, she made the only decision she could. She had only one chance, fight or die. Kaelin kicked the man to her right in the sternum. She felt the bones snap under her boot heel. He went down with an indrawn gasp. She kneed Rowley in the groin. She gouged at the eyes of the man on her left. It bought her an opening. She raced for it, only to be brought up short when a man behind got her by the hair, jerking her violently back. She spun, kicking him in the side, using her elbows as men closed in. It was the last strike she landed. They caught her arms. A heavy blow slammed into her middle. She instantly knew it had done something terrible to her. Another to her face, and then another took her senses. She couldn't get her wind. She didn't know up from down. She couldn't breathe. She tried to cover her face, but they had her arms. She gasped as more fists hammered her middle. More snapped her head this way and that. She tried to swallow the blood in her mouth before it choked her. She heard the men growl like a pack of dogs and grunt with the effort of hitting her as hard as they could. The fierce panic of helplessness seized her. The blows rained down. She hung helpless. The pain was stunning. They pounded her toward the ground. Blackness, like death itself, swallowed her. And then the pain ebbed away into nothingness, and the merciful peace of the light enveloped her. In a daze, Richard walked through the field of moonlit wheat. Everything was such a mess. He felt as if so much was piled on top of him he couldn't breathe. He didn't know what to do. The chimes, the imperial order, none of it was going right. Yet everyone depended on him, whether or not they knew it. The people of the Midlands counted on him to repel the imperial order. The Daharans depended on him for leadership. Everyone was in danger from the chimes, and they were growing stronger by the day. On top of that, to have worked and sacrificed so much for these people of Anderith only to have them turn away from him was crushing. The worst of it, though, was that he and Kaelin had to put it all before a child. Richard was willing to risk Shota, if Kaelin was. He knew the danger a child could pose, but he was willing to fight for her right to their own future. But how could they worry about a child now, with the chimes and the order both ruthlessly bearing down on the world? Adding Shota into the mix would be beyond reason. Kaelin saw that too, but he knew it was hard for her, putting duty first her whole life. But if they didn't do their part, their duty, the world would fall to Jagang's tyranny, into slavery. If the chimes didn't kill them all first. Before any of the rest of it, they had to stop the chimes. The chimes were nobody's fault but his. He was responsible for banishing them. Still, even if he could figure out what Joseph Ander had done, they had Jagang to deal with before they could think about having a child. Kalin understood that. He thanked the good spirits for that one thing good in his life, Kalin. He realized he must be close to Fairfield. He should turn back. Kalin would be worried. He had been gone a long time. He didn't want to worry her. She had enough worries. He hoped she wouldn't be too distraught about not having a child right now. As he turned, he thought he heard something. He straightened and listened. He didn't know how long the noise had gone on because he hadn't been paying much attention to anything but trying to think of solutions to their problems. Now he cocked his head to hear. It sounded oddly like muffled thuds. Without stopping to think it over, Richard started running toward the sound. As he got closer, he realized he heard men grunting in effort, panting, exerting themselves. Richard burst upon them, a gang of men beating someone on the ground. He seized the hair of one and yanked him back. Under the man, he saw a bloody body. They were beating the poor soul to death. Richard recognized the man he had. It was one of the messengers, Rowley, he thought the man's name was. He had a wild, savage look in his eyes. Rowley, seeing that it was Richard, immediately went for his throat, crying, "Get him!" Richard whipped his other hand around Rowley's neck, seized his chin, bent him over, and yanked back, snapping his neck. Rowley went down in a limp heap. Another man sprang forward. His onrushing momentum was his worst mistake. Richard rammed the heel of his hand square into the man's face. He was still falling across Rowley as Richard snatched the red hair of another, pulling him forward, and drove his knee up into the man's jaw. His jaw broken, he staggered back. The men were all up now, and Richard realized he might soon be joining the body on the ground. His advantage was that they were already tired from their exertion. His disadvantage was that they greatly outnumbered him, and they were mad with bloodlust. Just as they were about to dive onto Richard, they saw something and scattered. Richard spun around and saw the Baka Talmana blade masters sweeping in out of the night, their swords whistling through the night air. Richard realized they must have been shadowing him as he went for his walk to be alone. He hadn't even known they were there. As they went after the mob, Richard knelt down beside the body in the trampled wheat. Whoever it was, they were dead. Richard stood with a sorrowful sigh. He stared down at the broken form that had once been a person, probably only a short time before. It looked like it must have been a terrible end. If only he had been closer, sooner, he might have been able to stop it. Suddenly not having the stomach to look at the bloody body or others nearby, Richard walked away. He hadn't gone more than a few paces when a thought brought him to a halt. He turned around and looked. He winced at the notion, but then thought, what if it had been someone he cared about? Wouldn't he want somebody who was there to do whatever they could? He was the only one around to help, if he even could. He guessed it was worth a try. The person was already dead. There was nothing to lose. He ran back and knelt beside the body. He couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman, except that there were pants, so he assumed it to be a man. He put a hand under the neck and wiped some of the mask of blood from the swollen, cut lips, and then put his over them. He remembered what Denna had done to him when he was near death. He recalled Kara doing it to Du Shailu. He blew a breath of life into the lifeless corpse. He lifted his mouth and listened to the breath wheeze from the body. He blew another breath, and then another, and then another. He knelt by the body for what seemed like ages, but he knew could be only minutes, blowing in the breath of life, hoping against hope that the poor unfortunate soul would still be with them. He prayed to the good spirits for help. He wanted so much for something good to come of his experience at the hands of Denna, the Mord Sith. He knew Denna would want life to be her legacy. Kara had already brought Du Shailu back, proving that Mord Sith could do more than take life. He again prayed fervently to the good spirits to help him, to keep this soul here with this person rather than take it now. With a gasp, life returned. Someone was coming. Richard looked up and saw two of the blade masters trotting back. Richard didn't need to ask if they were successful. That gang of young men would murder no more people in the night. Someone else was coming too. It was an older gentleman in dark clothes. He rushed up with frightening urgency. The man was staggered by the sight.
"Oh, dear Creator, not another one."
"Another one?" Richard asked. The man fell to his knees, seeming not to hear Richard. He took up a bloody hand, pressing it to his cheek.
"Thank the Creator," he whispered.
He looked up at Richard.
"I have a carriage," he pointed. "Just there on the road. Help me get this poor wretch to my carriage and we can take him to my home."
"Where?" Richard asked.
"Fairfield,"
the man said, watching the blade masters carefully, tenderly lift the unconscious but breathing person. "Well," Richard said, wiping the blood from his mouth, "I guess it's a lot closer than the camp with my soldiers." Richard thought he might have to help the man, but the man refused the offer of a helping arm.
"Are you Lord Rahl, then?"
Richard nodded. The man stopped then, pulling Richard's hand up to shake it.
"Lord Rahl, I'm honored to meet you, though not under such circumstances. My name is Edwin Winthrop."
Richard pumped the man's hand. "Master Winthrop?"
"Edwin, please."
Edwin grasped Richard's shoulders.
"Lord Rahl, this is just terrible. My beloved wife, Claudine."
Edwin fell into tears. Richard gently took hold of his arms to be sure the man wouldn't collapse.
"My beloved wife, Claudine, was murdered in just this fashion. Beaten to death out on this road."
"I'm so sorry," Richard said, now understanding Edwin's reaction.
"Let me help this poor wretch. No one was there to help my Claudine as you've helped this person. Please, Lord Rahl, let me help."
"It's Richard, Edwin. I would like nothing better than for you to help." Richard watched as Gian and his blade masters helped to carefully load the person into the carriage. "I'd like 3 of you to go with Edwin. We can't tell if whoever is responsible for this will try again." "There will be no one to report their failure," Gian said. "They will realize it sooner or later," Richard turned to Edwin. "You must not tell anyone of this, or you will be in danger. They might come to finish the job." Edwin was nodding as he climbed into his carriage.
"I have a healer, a lifelong friend I can trust."
Richard and 2 of the blade masters walked the lonely road back to camp in silence. They had previously expressed their absolute faith that he would banish the chimes that had tried to kill their spirit woman. Richard didn't have the heart to tell them he was no closer to doing so than he was back then. When he got back, most of the camp was asleep. Richard wasn't in the mood to talk with the officers or sentries. He was thinking about Joseph Ander and the chimes. Kaelin wasn't in their tent. She had probably gone to be with Du Shailu. Du Shailu had come to value Kaelin's presence, the comfort of another woman. It was close to time for the baby to be born. Richard took Joseph Ander's journey book and a lamp and went to another tent used by officers for planning. He wanted to work on translating more of the journey book, but didn't want to keep Kaelin from sleeping when she got back. Richard knew that if he worked in their tent, she would want to sit up with him. There was no need for that. Chapter 67. Richard was puzzling over an involved and confusing translation, trying to work through the maze of possible meanings, when Gian slipped into the tent. The soldiers would have asked permission to enter. The blade masters just assumed they had permission to go wherever they wanted. After the constant formality with the soldiers, Richard found it refreshing. "Kaharin, you must come with me. Du Shailu has sent me." Richard shot to his feet. "The baby? The baby is coming? I'll get Kaelin. Let's go." "No." Gian put a restraining hand against Richard's shoulder. "Not your child. She sent me to get you, and she said to come alone." "She doesn't want me to get Kaelin?" "No, Kaharin. Please, you must do as our spirit woman, your wife, asks." Richard had never seen such a look of concern in Gian's dark eyes. The man was always stone with a sword. Richard held out a hand, inviting Gian to lead the way. To his surprise, it was near dawn. Richard had been working the entire night. He hoped Kaelin was asleep. If she wasn't, she would scold him for not getting any rest. Gian had 2 horses saddled and waiting. Richard was startled. The man would run rather than ride unless Du Shailu told him to ride, and that was just about never. "What's going on?" Richard gestured off toward Du Shailu's tent. "I thought Du Shailu wanted me." Gian swung into his saddle. "She is in the city." "What is she doing in Fairfield?" "I'm not sure it's safe there for her, not after they've been turning everyone against us." "Please, Kaharin, I beg you, come with me and hurry." Richard sprang up onto his horse. "Of course. I'm sorry, Gian. Let's go." Richard was beginning to worry that Du Shailu had already come to trouble from people in Fairfield. They knew she was with Richard and Kaelin. For that matter, they knew she was Richard's wife. He urged his horse into a run. Anxiety twisted in his gut. The door to a house set back among trees opened. Edwin peered out. Richard, by now in a state of deep concern, relaxed a bit. The person they saved was probably not making it, and they wanted him to see them before death came, since he had breathed the breath of life back into them. Richard didn't understand what Du Chaillu was doing there, but he surmised that she had a common bond with the person, having been brought back to life in the same way herself. Edwin, looking concerned and frightened, led them back through hallways and through well-kept rooms in the large house. It had an empty, quiet, sad feel to it. With Edwin's wife murdered, Richard thought it was to be expected. They reached a room at the end of a short, dimly lit hall. The door was closed. Gian knocked softly, and then escorted the despondent Edwin away. Edwin caught Richard's sleeve.
Anything you need, Richard, I'm here.
Richard nodded, and Edwin let Gian take him away. The door eased open. Du Chaillu peered out. When she saw it was Richard, she came out, putting a hand to his chest, backing him away. She pulled the door closed behind herself. She kept the restraining hand on his chest. Richard, you must listen to me. You must listen very carefully and not become crazy. Crazy? Crazy about what? Richard, please, this is important. You must listen and do as I say. Promise me. Richard could feel the blood draining out of his face. He nodded. I promise, Du Chaillu. What is it? She stepped closer. Keeping the hand on his chest, she added the other to his arm. Richard, the person you found, it was Kaelin. That's not possible. I'd know Kaelin. Du Chaillu's eyes were brimming with tears. Richard, please, I don't know if she will live. You brought her back, but I don't know if... I wanted you to come. He was having trouble getting his breath. But... he couldn't think. But I would have known. Du Chaillu, you must be wrong. I would have known if it was Kaelin. Du Chaillu squeezed his arm. I did not know myself until we cleaned some... Richard made for the door. Du Chaillu pushed him back. You promised to listen. Richard was hardly hearing her. He couldn't think. He could only see that bloody, broken body lying there in the field. He couldn't make himself believe it was Kaelin. Richard pushed his fingers back into his hair. He struggled to find his voice. Du Chaillu, please don't do this to me. Please don't you do this to me. She shook the arm. You must have strength or she has no chance. Please do not go crazy on me. What do you need? Name it. Name it, Du Chaillu. Tears were running down his face. Please tell me what you need. I need you to listen to me. Are you listening? Richard nodded. He wasn't sure what she was asking, but he nodded as his mind was racing. He could cure her. He had magic. Healing was additive. The chimes took all the additive magic. She shook him again. Richard! I'm sorry. What? I'm listening. Du Chaillu finally could no longer hold his gaze. She lost her child. Richard blinked. Then you are wrong. It can't be Kaelin. Du Chaillu stared at the floor and took a deep breath. Kaelin was pregnant. She told me when we were at the place where you read the things of the Anderman. Westbrook? Du Chaillu nodded. There, before you went with her riding alone up the mountain lake, she told me. She made me promise not to tell you. She said only it was a long story. I think now you have the right to my broken promise. She has lost her child. Richard sank to the floor. Du Chaillu hugged him as he wept uncontrollably. Richard, I understand your pain, but this will not help her. Richard somehow forced himself to stop. He leaned back against the wall, numb and dazed, waiting for Du Chaillu to tell him what he could do. You must stop the chimes. He rushed to his feet. What? You could heal her if you had your magic. It all fell into place. He had to stop the chimes. That was all. Just stop the chimes and then heal Kaelin. Richard, when we were at that place where Kaelin told me she was with child... The words "with child" jolted him anew, as he realized that Kaelin was going to have a child, and he never knew, and now it had already died. Westbrook, Richard, listen to me. When we were there, the people said there was terrible wind and rain and fire that destroyed almost everything of that man. Yes, I believe it was the chimes. They hated him. You must have that same hate in your heart for the Chimes, so that you may vanquish them. Then you can have your magic back and heal Kalin." Richard's mind was racing. The Chimes hated Joseph Ander. Why? Not because the man had sent them back. He didn't do that. He had instead enslaved the Chimes to serve him. The Dominie Dirch was somehow connected to what he did. When Richard and Kalin freed the Chimes, they took their vengeance on certain of his possessions. But why the things at Westbrook, and not those in the library at the minister's estate? Joseph Ander's words rang in his head. "In the end, I have concluded I must reject the Creator and the Keeper both. I instead create my own solution, my own rebirth and death, and in so doing will always protect my people. And so farewell, for I shall lay my soul on troubled waters, and thus watch over for all time that which I have so carefully wrought, and which is now safeguarded and inviolate." Troubled waters. Richard finally understood what Joseph Ander had done. "I have to go. Du Chaillu, I have to go." Richard seized her by the shoulders. "Please keep her alive until I get back. You must." "Richard, we will do our best. You have my word as your wife." "Edwin!" The man came shuffling down the hall.
"Yes, Richard. What can I do? Name it."
"Can you hide these people here? My wife." Richard had to swallow to keep control. "Can you keep Kalin here, and Du Chaillu and her 5 men? Edwin swept his arm in a wide arc, indicating his home.
"It's a big house. A lot of room. No one will know who is here. I keep few friends, and the ones I have I would trust with my life."
Richard shook the man's hand. "Thank you, Edwin. In return, I would ask you to leave your home when I come back."
"What? Why?"
"The Imperial Order is coming."
"But aren't you going to stop them?"
Richard threw up his hands. "How? More to the point, why? These people have rejected the chance I've given them. Edwin, they murdered your wife just as they tried to murder mine. And you would have me risk the lives of good people to preserve their well-being?" Edwin sagged.
"No, I suppose not. There are some of us who were on your side, Richard. Some of us tried."
"I know. That is why I'm giving you warning. Tell your friends to get out while they can. I'm sending my men out today. The Imperial Order will be here within 2 weeks.
"How long will you be gone?"
Maybe 8 days at the most. I have to get up to the wasteland above the Nerif Valley."
"Nasty place."
Richard nodded. "You've no idea."
"We will care for the Mother Confessor as well as anyone can."
"Do you have barrels, Edwin?" The man frowned.
"Yes, down in the cellar."
"Fill them with water. Collect food now. In a few days, the water and anything growing may not be safe."
"Why would that be?"
Richard ground his teeth. "Jagang is coming here for food. I'm going to give him a bellyache at least."
"Richard,"
Du Chaillu said in a soft voice, meeting his gaze, "I'm not sure. Do you want to see her before you go?" Richard steeled himself. "Yes, please." Richard galloped his horse the whole way back to the encampment. He could get a fresh horse there, so he didn't spare the poor animal. It looked to him as he rode in that Captain Myford had the troops at a high state of alert. Sentries were doubled and posted farther out than usual. They had no doubt heard from the Bakatal Mana that there had been trouble. Richard hoped the man wouldn't ask about Kalin. He didn't think he could hold himself together if he had to tell him about her, if he had to describe the sight of her in that bed. Even knowing it was her, Richard had hardly recognized her. It was a sight beyond horror. It broke his heart. He had never felt so alone in the world, nor known such anguish. Instead of falling to pieces, Richard struggled to put his mind to the task at hand. He had to put Kalin out of his mind if he was to help her. He knew that was impossible, but he tried to keep his thoughts on Joseph Ander and what must be done. He needed to be able to heal her. He would do anything to remedy her suffering. Thankfully, she wasn't conscious. Richard thought he knew what Joseph Ander had done, but he didn't have the slightest idea of what he might do to counter it. He figured he had several days until he got there to think about it. Richard still had the subtractive side of his power. He had used that before and understood a little about it. Nathan, a prophet and Richard's ancestor, had once told him that his gift was different from that of other wizards because he was a war wizard. Richard's power worked through need, and it was invoked by anger. Richard had a powerful need now. He had enough anger for 10 wizards. The thought hit him. That was part of the way Joseph Ander described what he did. He created what he needed. Richard wished he knew how this insight might help him. Captain Myford clapped a hand to the leather over his heart as Richard leaped off his horse. "Captain, I need a fresh horse. In fact, I had better have 3. I have to go." Richard pressed his fingers to his forehead, trying to think. "I want you to get these men packed up, and as soon as all the rest come in from watching the vote, I want you out of here." "Where are we going, Lord Rahl, if I might ask?" "You and your men are going back to General Rybish. I won't be going with you." The captain followed Richard as he went to gather up his and Kalen's things. As Captain Myford followed, he issued orders to several of his men, calling for fresh horses for Lord Rahl along with supplies. Richard told one of the soldiers he wanted their best mounts for a long, hard ride. The man ran off to see to the task. The captain waited outside as Richard went into the tent to pack. He began gathering their things. When he picked up Kalen's white Mother Confessor dress, his hands began trembling, and he fell to his knees, overcome with grief. Alone in the tent, he prayed, begging the good spirits as never before to help him. He promised them anything they wanted in return. Recalling that the only thing he knew he could do was to banish the chimes so he might heal Kalen, he set about finishing as quickly as he could. Outside, the horses were waiting. It was just getting light. "Captain, I want you and your men to get back to General Rybish as soon as you can." "And the Domini Dirch?" "With the reports of the Special Ander Guard units, I think we may have trouble." "Will we be safe going past the Domini Dirch?" "No. From the reports, I would suspect the guard troops to be Imperial Order men. I would also expect them to take the Domini Dirch in order to keep Rybish at bay. From this moment on, you are to consider yourself in enemy territory. Your orders are to escape. If anyone tries to stop you, kill them and keep going. If the order, as I suspect, takes the Domini Dirch, we can use the one weakness they will have. They will be spread too thin to resist you in force. Assume Imperial Order troops will be manning the Domini Dirch. Concentrate your force into a cavalry charge and punch through their line. Because they have control of the Domini Dirch, they probably won't offer much resistance, thinking they can kill you once you go past." The man was looking worried. "Then, you think you will have the stone weapons down by then, Lord Rahl? You will counter their magic?" "I hope to, but I may not. Just in case, I want you and all your men to plug your ears and your horses' ears with wax and cotton or cloth. Plug them tight, so you can't hear until you're over the horizon." "You mean that will protect us?" "Yes." Richard thought he understood the way the Domini Dirch worked. Du Chaillu had told them that when she drowned, she heard the chimes of death. Joseph Ander would have needed a way to control and focus the killing power of the chimes. He gave them the answer in what he had created. The Domini Dirch are bells. They would be bells for a reason, to be heard. If you can't hear them, then you won't be harmed. The captain cleared his throat. "Lord Rahl, I don't mean to question your knowledge of things of magic, but can a weapon of that much destructive power be defeated so easily?" "It was done before, I believe. I think the Haken people who once invaded must have figured it out too, and in so doing were able to get past." "But Lord Rahl—" "Captain, I'm the magic against magic. Trust me. It will work. I trust you to be the steel. Trust me with the magic." "Yes, Lord Rahl. Once past, head for General Rybish. This is important. Tell him I want him to pull back." "What? Now that you have the way past the Domini Dirch, you don't want him to use it?" "The Domini Dirch are going to be destroyed. I can't leave them for Jagang to hide behind, but I don't want our forces to come down here. Jagang is also coming here for food for his army. I hope to spoil some of that food. Tell the general my orders are for him to protect the routes up into the Midlands. Out here on the plains, he doesn't stand a chance against the Order's numbers. He will have a better chance keeping Jagang from advancing into the rest of the Midlands if our forces fight our way, not Jagang's." "Yes, sir. Wise advice." "It should be. It's General Rybish's advice. I hope, too, to reduce the Order's numbers. Tell him to use his discretion." "What about you, Lord Rahl?"
Where is he to find you? You tell him to worry about his men, not me. I'm not sure where I'll be. Rybish knows what to do. That's why they made him a general. He would know better than I what to do about soldiering. Yes, sir. The general is a good man. Richard held up a finger for emphasis. This is important. I want you to follow this order, and I want Rybish to follow it. The people of Anderith have made their choice. I don't want a single one of our men lifting a weapon to help them. I don't want any of our men to have to shed blood for these people. Understand? Not one. The color left the captain's face. He backed away a half-step. Not one drop of our blood, Richard said. Yes, sir. I will tell the general your exact words. My orders. Richard climbed up into the saddle. And I mean that. You're all good men, Captain Meifert. Someday I want you going home to your families, not dying for nothing. The captain saluted with a fist to his heart. Our sincere hope, too, Lord Rall. Richard returned the salute, and then trotted his horse out of camp for the last time on his way to perform his final duty. Chapter 68. Darling, I'm home, Dalton called toward the bedroom. He had sent up a bottle of wine, along with a plate of Teresa's favorite dish, suckling rabbits roasted in a red wine sauce. Mr. Drummond was most pleased to be able to keep his job by complying with the unusual request. Perfumed candles were lit around the rooms, the drapes were drawn, and the servants all sent away. The master and the mistress wanted to be alone. Teresa met him at the bedroom door with a glass of wine and a smile.
Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you were able to come in early tonight. I've so looked forward to it all day.
As have I, he said with his best smile. She gave him a mischievous look.
I'm so looking forward to proving to you how much I love you, and to thank you for being so understanding about my duty to the sovereign.
Dalton slipped the silk robe from her shoulders, kissing her bare flesh. She giggled as he worked his kisses up her neck. She made a feeble effort to slow his advances. She hunched her head against his face.
Dalton, don't you want some wine?
I want you, he said in an intimate growl. It's been too long.
Oh, Dalton, I know. I've ached for you.
Then prove it, he teased. She giggled again against his continued kisses.
My, but what's gotten into you, Dalton? She moaned. Whatever it is, I like it.
Tess, I've taken the day off tomorrow, too. I want to make love to you tonight and all day tomorrow. She responded to his intimacies as he guided her toward their big bed with the hammered iron posts that looked like the columns outside the Office of Cultural Amity, the bed that belonged to the Minister of Culture, along with everything else in the magnificent apartments. Once, all of this splendor would have brought him great pleasure. Pleasure in what he had accomplished, in what he had attained, in how far he had come.
Dalton, please don't be disappointed, but Bertrand is expecting me tomorrow afternoon.
Dalton shrugged as he gently placed her on the bed. Well, we have tonight, and in the morning again, right? She beamed.
Of course, sweetheart. Tonight and for the morning. Oh, Dalton, I'm so happy you understand about the sovereign needing me.
But I do, darling. You may think this sounds strange, but in a way I find it exciting.
You do?
She grinned her wicked grin.
I like the idea of that. You being excited, I mean.
She watched as he opened her robe and kissed her breasts. He came up for breath. To know the sovereign himself chooses my wife, my beautiful Tess, and by the direct word of the Creator at that, is the best compliment a loyal Ander man could ever have.
Dalton, she said,
breathless from his kisses and caresses.
I've never seen you like this. She drew him closer. I like it. I like it a lot. Come here, let me show you how much.
Before she began, she pulled back.
Dalton, Bertrand was pleased, too. He said he liked your attitude. He said he found it exciting, too.
We all need our sovereign to guide us into the future and bring us the Creator's words. I'm so glad you can help relieve the sovereign's stress in this life. She was panting now.
Yes, Dalton, I do. I really do. It's so, I don't know, so wonderful to have such a high calling.
Why don't you tell me all about it, darling, as we make love? I'd like to hear it all.
Oh, Dalton, I'm so glad.
Dalton allowed himself a couple of days to recover after being with Tess. It had been an experience he once would have found the height of his existence. It once would have been a source of joy. After the experience, though, he needed to deprive himself of Tess for several days in order to be in a state of heightened need for a task such as he must now perform. The hallway was deserted outside her quarters and offices. Bertrand was in the opposite wing, with Teresa, having the stresses of his high office relieved. Dalton had made sure it was a time when Teresa was with Bertrand. The thought of it would help him to focus on the work at hand. Bertrand and his wife made sure they rarely encountered one another. Having their quarters in opposite wings helped. She did sometimes visit him, though. Their screaming battles were legendary among the staff. Bertrand one day sported a cut over his eye. He was usually able to duck the objects she hurled at him, but on that occasion she had caught him off guard. Partly because of Hildemara's popularity, but mostly because of her dangerous connections, Bertrand dared not confront, cross, or do away with his wife. She had warned him he had better hope she didn't die a sudden death of natural causes, or any other causes, lest his own health suddenly fail too. It was a threat Bertrand did not take lightly. For the most part, he simply avoided her. There were times, though, when his penchant for risk caused him to make foolish comments, or in some other way embarrass her, and then she went looking for him. It mattered not where he was, either, in his bed, his privy, or a meeting with wealthy backers. Bertrand generally avoided troubles with her by trying to take care, but there were times when he provoked her ire. It was a relationship that had worked on this estranged level for years, and had borne them a daughter neither cared for. Dalton had only seen her recently when they brought her back from boarding school in order to stand with them at public addresses decrying the horrors of an uncaring Lord Rall and the Mother Confessor. Now, the Lord Rall had been rejected by the people. Now the Mother Confessor was... Well, he wasn't sure what had become of her, but he was reasonably sure she was dead. It had cost Dalton some good men, but in war there were always losses. He would replace them if need be. Saren Rajak had died, too, a terrible infection that turned his blind face to a festering mass. But Dalton couldn't say he was at all unhappy about that. His grieving followers reported it a lingering and painful death. No, Dalton was not at all unhappy about that. Hildemara opened the door herself. A good sign, he thought. She was wearing a dress more revealing than usual. Another good sign, he hoped, since she had known he was coming. "Dalton, how kind of you to ask to pay me a visit. I've wondered how you've been getting along, and thought a talk long overdue. So, how have you been since your wife has been serving the needs of our sovereign?" He shrugged. "I've come to my way of dealing with it." Hildemara smiled, a cat seeing a mouse. "Ah, and so the lovely gifts?" "To thank you for... Might I come in?" She opened the door wider. He stepped inside, looking around at the unrestrained opulence. He had never been in the private quarters of the sovereign and his wife. Of course, his own wife was quite familiar with them, and had described them, Bertrand's anyway, in great detail. "You were saying about thanking me?" Dalton clasped his hands behind his back. "For opening my eyes." He gestured behind himself and smiled. "And your door, I might add." She chuckled politely. "I sometimes open my door to handsome men. I find it a sometimes rewarding experience." He closed the distance and took up her hand, kissing the back of it while looking her in the eye. He thought it a pathetically contrived act, but she responded as if she believed it sincere, and as if she were well pleased by the token of respect. Dalton had researched her private activities. It had taken every favor owed him, as well as some direct threats, and even an appointment of standing. He now knew what she liked and what she didn't. He knew she didn't like aggressive lovers. She liked them on the young side and attentive. She liked to be treated with the utmost reverence. She liked to be fawned over. He approached this visit like an elaborate feast, with each course in order and building to the main attractions. In this way, with a plan, he found it easier to proceed. "My lady, I fear to be so forward with a woman of your station, but I must be honest." She went to a table of inlaid silver and gold. From a silver tray, she picked a cut-glass bottle and poured herself a glass of rum. She also poured one for him, without asking,
and handed it to him with a smile. "Please, Dalton, we have a long history. I would like nothing better than your honesty. After all, I was honest with you about your wife." "Yes," he said. "You were, weren't you?" She took a sip and then laid a wrist over his shoulder. "And are you still languishing about that? Or have you come to face the realities of life?" "I must admit, Hildemara, that I have been lonely, what with my wife so often occupied. I never expected to find myself with a wife so often unavailable," she clucked sympathetically. "You poor dear. I know just how you feel. My husband is so often occupied himself." Dalton turned away as if embarrassed. "Since my wife is no longer bound by our vows, I find I have desires she is unable to satisfy. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I'm not experienced in this sort of thing. Most men, I guess, would find this sort of endeavor comes naturally to them. I don't." She came close up behind him, putting her mouth next to his ear. "Do go on, Dalton. I'm listening. Don't be shy. We're old friends." He turned to come face to face with her, giving her the chance to display her cleavage, something she believed was greatly appreciated. "Since my wife no longer is bound by her vows, being called upon by the sovereign, I don't see why I should be bound by mine, especially when I have longings." "Well, of course not." "And you once told me that I should come to you first if anything changed with the status of my vows. Well, if you're still interested, things have changed." Her answer was to kiss him. He found it less repulsive than he feared. By closing his eyes, he was able to actually enjoy it after a fashion. He was surprised, though, when she shifted immediately to the more advanced matters of the encounter. It would make little difference in the end result. If she wanted to go straight to it, that was fine by him. Chapter 69. It was as forbidding a place as Richard had heard. The highlands above the Narif Valley, a bleak wasteland. The wind howled in dirty gusts. He would expect Josephander to pick such a place. The mountains surrounding the dead lake were just as dead. They were rocky, brown, and barren of life, their peaks all crowned with snow. The thousands of runnels coming down the slopes sparkled in the sunlight like fangs. Juxtaposed with the bleak wasteland was the green of the paca plants, which looked almost like water lilies in the vast waters stretching across the wide lap of the surrounding mountains. Richard had left the horses down lower and climbed the narrow foot trail he found that led up to the lake. He had tied the horses on loose tethers and removed their tack, so that if he failed to return, they could eventually escape. Only one thing drove him on, and that was his love for Kaelin. He had to banish the chimes so that he could heal her. It was his sole purpose in life. He stood now on the sterile soil beside the poison waters, knowing what he had to do. He had to outthink, outcreate Josephander. There was no key to the riddle of the chimes. There was no answer. There was no solution waiting to be found. Josephander left no seam in his tapestry of magic. His only chance was to do what Josephander never would have expected. Richard had studied the man enough to understand the way he thought. He knew what Ander believed and what he expected people would try. Richard could do none of those things and expect to succeed. Richard would do that which Josephander chided the wizards to do, but which they couldn't see. He only hoped he had the strength to see it through to the end. He had ridden hard in the day, switching horses so they would make it, and yet be able to take him back. At night he had walked them until he could walk no more. He was exhausted, and hoped only that he could hold out long enough for Kaelin. From the gold-worked leather pouch on his belt, he pulled white sorcerer's sand. With the sand, Richard carefully began drawing a grace. Starting with the rays representing the gift, he drew it exactly opposite from the way Zed told him it must be drawn. He stood in the center, laying the lines of the gift inward toward himself. He drew the star, representing the Creator, next, and then the circle of life, and the square for the veil, and lastly, the outer circle for the beginning of the underworld. Imagination, Joseph had said, was what made a great wizard, for only a wizard with imagination was able to transcend the limitations of tradition.
A grace might rise in obedience to an inventive spell. Richard intended to raise more than that. From his place inside the grace, Richard lifted his fists to the sky. Ricciani Sintrosi Vasi, I call you forth. He knew what they needed. Joseph Ander had told him. Ricciani Sintrosi Vasi, I call you forth and offer you my soul. The water rippled as the wind rose. The water moved with deliberate intent. The wind coming across the water ignited into roiling flame. They were coming. Richard, charged with need and with anger, lowered his arms, pointing his fists off toward the edge of the lake, where it flowed at last over the rocky lip and on down into the Nerif Valley. His entire being focused there. Through his need and his anger, he called the subtractive side of his power, the side from the darkest things, the side from the underworld, from the shadows in the dark forever of the netherworld. Black lightning exploded, the bolts from his fists twisting together in a rope of howling annihilation, focused by his need, powered by his wrath. The edge of the mountain lake erupted in violence. The rock beyond disintegrated in a shower of steam and rubble from the touch of the black lightning. In an instant, the lower lake shore at the edge was no more. The destructive force of the subtractive magic vaporized it out of existence. With a thundering roar, the lake began to empty. The water churned as it pulled itself over the side. The edge foamed and frothed. The paca plants swirled with the water, tearing from the lake bottom. The vast lake of poisonous water plummeted over the brink. The fire, coming across the lake, the wind on the water, and the churning water itself, slowed as they approached. These were the essence of the chimes, the distillation that spoke for them. "Come to me," Richard commanded. "I offer you my soul." As the chimes began to circle ever closer, Richard drew something else from the pouch at his belt. And then, out in the lake as it emptied, leaving a muddy bottom where poisonous water receded, there came a shimmering to the air just above the falling water. Something began to coalesce, to take form in the world of life. Wavering in the air above the surface of the water, a figure began to appear, a robed figure, an old man made of smoke and glimmering light, a figure in pain. Richard threw his fists up again. "Ricciani Sintrosi Vasi, come to me!" And they did. Around him swept the substance of death. It was almost more than Richard could take, standing there in the center of a maelstrom of death. It was as abhorrent a feeling as he had ever felt. The chimes called to him with seductive sounds from another world. Richard let them. He smiled at their summons. He let them come, these thieves of souls. And then he lifted his arm to point. "Your master." Page 496. The chimes howled around him with rage. They recognized the one rising up before them. "There he is, slaves, your master."
"Who calls me?"
came a cry from across the water. "Richard Rall, descendant of Ulrich. I am the one who has come to be your master, Joseph Ander."
"You have found me in my sanctuary. You are the first. I commend you."
"And I condemn you, Joseph Ander, to your place in the afterlife, where all must go when their time here is done." Chimes of laughter rang out over the lake.
"Finding me is one thing, disturbing me another. But to dictate to me is altogether different. You have not the power to begin to do such a thing. You cannot even envision what I can create."
"Ah, but I have," Richard called out over the falling water. "Water, hear me. Air, see what I show you. Fire, feel the truth of it." Around him, the three chimes turned and spun, wary of what he had to offer them. Again Richard thrust out his hand. "This is your master, the one who appropriated you to his bidding instead of yours. There is his soul, stripped bare for you." Concern darkened the face of Joseph Ander's form.
"What are you doing? What do you think you can accomplish with this?"
"Truth, Joseph Ander. I strip you of the lie of your existence." Richard lifted the hand, opening it toward Joseph Ander, opening the hand that held the balance. The black sorcerer's sand. Richard let a trickle of black lightning crackle between him and the spirit of Joseph Ander. "There he is, Richani. Hear him. There he is, Vasi. See him. There he is, Sintrosi. Feel him through my touch." Joseph Ander tried to throw back magic of his own, but he had consigned himself to another world, one of his own making. He could not bridge that void. But Richard had called him, and could reach through. "Now, my chimes, this is your choice. My soul or his. The man who would not surrender his soul to the afterlife. The man who would not go to your master in the underworld, but became your master in this world, where he enslaved you for all time. Or my soul, standing here in the center of this grace, where I will pull you to me, and you will serve me in this world as you have served him. Choose then, taking vengeance, or going back to slavery." "He lies!" Ander's spirit cried out. The storm of chimes around Richard made their choice. They saw the truth Richard had presented them. They crackled across the bridge Richard had created, the void in the world of life. The world shook with the ferocity of it. Across that bridge, with a howl of rage that could come only from the world of the dead, they seized Joseph Ander's soul and took him with them back to that world whence they had come. They took him home. In an instant that stretched for an eternity, the veil between those worlds was open. In that instant, death and life touched. In the sudden silence that followed, Richard held his hands out in front of himself. He seemed to be whole. He found that remarkable. The realization of what he had just done came over him. He had created magic. He had righted what Joseph Ander had wrongly corrupted. Now he had to get back to Kaylin, if she was still alive. He made himself banish that thought. She had to be alive. With a gasp, Zed opened his eyes. It was dark. He groped and found walls of rock. He stumbled forward toward light, toward sound. He realized he was back in his body. He was no longer in the Raven. He didn't understand how that could be. It was real, though. He looked at his hands. Not feathers. Hands. He had his soul back. He fell to his knees, weeping with relief. To lose his soul was beyond what he expected, and he had expected the worst. Without his soul, he had been able to inhabit the Raven. He brightened a bit. That was an experience he had never had. No wizard had ever succeeded in projecting himself into an animal. And to think, it had only required surrendering his soul. He decided that once was enough. He walked on toward the light, toward the roar of water. He remembered where he was. Reaching the edge, he dove into the lake and swam to the far shore. Zed dragged himself out on the far bank. Without thinking, he swept a hand down his robes to dry himself. And then he realized his power was back. His strength, his gift was back. At a sound, he looked up. Spider nuzzled him. Grinning, Zed rubbed the friendly soft nose. "Spider, girl, good to see you, my friend. Good to see you." Spider snorted her pleasure, too. Zed found the saddle and the rest of the tack where he had left it. Just for the delight of it, he floated the blanket and saddle onto Spider's back. Spider thought it interesting. Spider was a good sort, and a good horse. Zed turned at a sound from above. Something was coming down the mountain. Water. The lake, for some reason, had given way. It was all coming down. Zed sprang up onto Spider. "Time to get out of here, girl." Spider obliged him. Dalton had just come back into his office when he heard someone come in behind him. It was Stein. When the man turned to close the door, Dalton glanced to the bottom of Stein's cape and saw the scalp he had added. Dalton went to the side table and poured himself a glass of water. He was feeling warm and a little dizzy. Well, that was to be expected. "What do you want, Stein?" "Just a social visit." "Ah," Dalton said. He took a drink. "Nice new office you got yourself." It was nice. Everything was the best. The only thing from his old office was the silver scroll stand behind the desk. He liked the sword stand, and brought it along. As if reminded, he fingered the hilt of his sword in the stand. "Well," Stein said, "you've earned it. No doubt about that. You've done good for yourself, though.
Good for yourself and your wife.
Dalton gestured. New sword, Stein? A little too fancy for your taste, I would think. The man seemed pleased that Dalton had noticed the weapon.
This here, he said,
lifting it with a thumb by the down-swept crossguard a few inches out of its scabbard,
is the sword of truth. The real sword carried by the Seeker.
Dalton found it unsettling that a man like Stein would have it. And what are you doing with it?
One of my men brought it to me. Quite a lot of trouble, too.
Really? Dalton asked, feigning interest.
They captured a Mord Sith in the process of bringing it to me. The real sword of truth, and a real Mord Sith, imagine that.
Quite the achievement. The Emperor will be pleased.
He will be when I present him with the sword. He is pleased with the news you sent, too. To have defeated Lord Rahl so resoundingly is an achievement. It won't be long until our forces are here and we catch him. And the Mother Confessor, have you found her yet?
No. Dalton took another drink of water. But with the spells Sister Penthea contributed, I don't see how she has a chance. From the look of the knuckles of my men, they did their job. He paused, looked down. Up until they got caught and killed, anyway. No, this is one encounter the Mother Confessor is not going to live through, if she is still alive. I will hear about it soon enough. If she is dead, he shrugged, then we may never find her body. Dalton leaned against his desk. When will Jagang be here?
Not long. Week, maybe. The advance guard may be sooner. He is looking forward to setting up residence in your fine city.
Dalton scratched his forehead. He had things to do. Not that any of it really mattered.
Well, I'll be around if you need me,
Stein said. He turned back from the door.
Oh, and Dalton, Bertrand told me that you were more than understanding about your wife and him.
Dalton shrugged. Why not? She is just a woman. I can snap my fingers and have a dozen. Hardly anything to get possessive about. Stein seemed genuinely pleased.
I'm glad to see you've come around. The order will suit you. We don't hold to notions of possessive attitudes toward women.
Dalton was trying to think of places the Mother Confessor could have gone to ground. Well, I'll love the order, then. I don't hold those notions myself. Stein scratched his stubble.
I'm happy to know you feel that way, Dalton. Since you do, I'd like to compliment you on your choice of a whore for a wife.
Dalton, turning to look over papers, stiffened. I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh, Bertrand, he loans her to me now and then. He was bragging on her and wanted me to have some myself. He told her the Creator wanted her to please me. I just had to tell you, she's quite the hot one.
Stein turned toward the door. There's one more thing, Dalton said.
What's that? He asked, turning back.
Dalton brought the tip of his sword whistling around and sliced Stein's belly open just below his weapons belt. He made the cut shallow, so as not to slice through everything, just deep enough so that the man's bowels would spill out at his feet in front of him. Stein gasped in shock, his jaw dropping, his eyes showing the whites all around as he stared down. He looked up at Dalton as he was falling to his knees. The gasp turned to panting grunts. You know, Dalton said, as it turns out, I really am the possessive type. Thank the good spirits, your end was quick. Stein collapsed on his side. Dalton stepped over him, around behind him. But just because it's quick, I don't want you to feel you're missing out on anything, or that I'm neglecting what you have coming. Dalton grabbed Stein's greasy hair in a fist. He sliced his sword around the top of Stein's forehead, put a boot to the man's back, and ripped his scalp off. He came around and showed it to the shrieking man. That was for Franca, by the way, just so you know. As Stein lay on the floor, his viscera spilled out, his head bleeding profusely, Dalton casually walked to the door and opened it. Pleased the new man hadn't opened the door without permission, despite all the screaming. Phil, you and Gregory get in here. Yes, Minister Campbell? Phil, Stein here is making a mess in my office. Please help him out. Yes, Minister Campbell. And I don't want him ruining the carpets. Dalton, as he picked up some papers from his desk, glanced down at the screaming man. Take him over there and throw him out the window. Chapter 70. Richard crashed through the front door. He saw people there, but he headed straight for Kalen. John seized his arm. Richard, wait. What? What is it? How is she? She is still alive. She has made it past their critical time. Richard nearly collapsed with relief. He felt tears course down his face, but he kept himself together. He was so tired he had trouble doing the simplest things. He hadn't been able to turn the knob to open the door, and had not been able to stop either. I can heal her now. My power is back. Richard turned to the hall. John seized his arm again. I know. Du Shailu has her power back too. You must see her first. I'll see her later. I have to heal Kaelin before anything else. No! John shouted in Richard's face. It surprised him so that he halted. Why? What's wrong? Du Shailu said she knows now why she came to you. Du Shailu said we must not let you touch Kaelin until you see her first. She made me swear I would draw my sword on you before I let you near Kaelin. Please, Karin, do not make me do that, I beg you. Richard took a breath and tried to calm himself. All right, if it's that important, then where is Du Shailu? John led Richard into the hall and to a door next to the room where Kaelin was. Richard took a long look at the door to Kaelin, but then followed John's urging and went in the other door. Du Shailu was sitting in a chair holding a baby. She beamed up at Richard. He knelt before her and looked at the sleeping bundle in her arms. Du Shailu, he said in a whisper. Beautiful. You have a daughter, husband. With all the things in Richard's head, arguing with Du Shailu about the child's parentage was the last of them. I have named her Kara, in honor of the one who saved our life. Richard nodded. Kara will be pleased, I'm sure. Du Shailu put a hand on his shoulder. Richard, are you all right? You look like you have been to the land of the dead. He smiled a little. In a way I have. John said your gift is back. She nodded. Yes, and you must believe in it. My gift is to feel a spell and silence it. Du Shailu, I need to heal Kaelin. No, you must not. Richard raked his fingers back through his hair. Du Shailu, I know you want to help, but that is crazy. She gripped his shirt in his fist. Listen to me, Richard. I came to you for a reason. This is the reason, I know now. I came to save you the pain of losing Kaelin. She has magic in her that is a trap. If you touch her with your magic to heal her, it will spring the magic and kill her. It was a way of making sure they killed her. Richard, trying to remain calm, licked his lips. But you have the power to annul spells. When we first met, Sister Verna told me so. Du Shailu, you can annul this spell and then I can heal her. Du Shailu held his gaze in the grip of hers. No, listen to me. You are not listening to what is. You are hearing only what you wish to be. Listen to what is. This spell is the kind of magic I cannot touch with mine. I cannot make it fade away like other magic. It is in her like a barb on a fishhook. Your magic that heals will trigger it, and you will kill her. Do you hear me, Richard? If you touch her with your magic, you will kill her. Richard pressed a hand to his forehead. Then what are we to do? She is still alive. If she lived this long, she has a good chance. You must care for her. She must recover without magic. Once she is better, the spell will fade away, just like a hook in a fish dissolves. Before she is well, it will be gone. But she will be well enough by then so that your magic will not be needed. Richard nodded. All right. Thank you, Du Shailu. I mean that. Thank you for everything. She hugged him, even with the baby between them. But we have to get out of here. The Order is going to be here any time. We have to get out of Anderith. The man, Edwin, he is a good man. He has fixed a wagon for you to take Kaelin away. How is she? Is she awake? In and out. We feed her a little, let her drink, give her what herbs and cures we can. Richard, she is very badly hurt, but she is alive. I think she will be well again, though. I really believe that. Du Shailu got up, taking her new baby with her, and led Richard to the next room. Richard was exhausted, but his heart was hammering so hard he felt wide awake again. He felt so helpless, though, that he let Du Shailu lead him. The curtains were drawn, and the room was dimly lit. Kaelin was lying on her back, covered most of the way with blankets. Richard looked down at the face he knew so well, but didn't recognize. The sight took his breath. He had to struggle to stay on his feet. He struggled, too, to hold back his tears. She was unconscious. He gently took her limp hand in his, but there was no response. Du Chaillu went around to the other side of the bed. Richard gestured. Du Chaillu understood and smiled at the idea. She gently laid little baby Kara in the crook of Kalen's arm. The baby, still asleep, nuzzled in Kalen's arm. Kalen stirred. Her hand partly curled around the baby, and a small smile came to her lips. The smile was the first thing Richard recognized as Kalen. Outside, once they gently got Kalen situated in the special carriage Edwin had converted, they brought it out of the carriage house into the early morning light. A man named Linscott, once a director and still a friend of Edwin's, had helped make the cover for the carriage and altered the suspension so it would ride more gently. Linscott and Edwin were part of a group that had been resisting the corrupt rule in Anderith. Unsuccessfully, it turned out. Now, at Richard's urging, they were going to leave. There weren't many, but some people were going to escape. At the side of the house, in the shade of a cherry tree, Dalton Campbell was waiting for them. Richard instantly tensed, prepared for a battle. Dalton Campbell, though, didn't look to have any fight in him.
Lord Rawle, I came to see you and the Mother Confessor off.
Richard glanced over at the baffled faces of some of the others. They seemed as surprised as Richard. And how did you know we were here? The man smiled. It's what I do, Lord Rawle. It's my job to know things. At least it was. Linscott was looking like he was about to go for the man's throat. Edwin, too, looked ready for blood. Dalton didn't seem to care. Richard signaled with a tilt of his head, and Jian and Du Chaillu ushered everyone else back. With the rest of the blade masters nearby, none of them seemed too concerned about this one man. May I say, Lord Rawle, that in another time, another place, I think we could have been friends. I don't, Richard said. The man shrugged. Maybe not. He pulled a folded blanket from under his arm. I brought this in case you need another to keep your wife warm. Richard was confused by the man, and by what he wanted. Dalton placed the blanket off to the side in the carriage. Richard figured that Dalton could have caused a lot of trouble if he intended it, so that wasn't what he was about. I just wanted to wish you good luck. I hope the Mother Confessor will be well soon. The Midlands needs her. She is a fine woman. I'm sorry I tried to have her killed. What did you say? He looked up into Richard's eyes. I'm the one who sent those men. If you get your magic back, Lord Rawle, please don't try to heal her with it. A Sister of the Dark provided the spell to kill her with the dark side of the magic if healing is tried on what was done to her. You must let her get better on her own. Richard thought he should be killing the man, but for some reason he was just standing there, staring at him as he confessed. If you wish to kill me, please feel free. I don't really care. What do you mean? You have a wife who loves you. Cherish her. And your wife? Dalton shrugged. Ah, well, I'm afraid she isn't going to make it. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? There is a nasty illness going around among the prostitutes in Fairfield. Somehow my wife, the Sovereign, his wife, and I have acquired it. We are already coming ill. Very unfortunate. It's an unpleasant death, I'm told. The poor Sovereign is weeping and inconsolable. Considering it was the one thing he feared above all else, one would think he would have been more careful in choosing his partners. The Domini Dirch, too, I've heard, have crumbled to dust. All our work seems to be coming undone. I expect that Emperor Jagang, when he arrives, is going to be quite displeased. We can hope, Richard said. Dalton smiled. Well, I've things to do, unless, of course, you wish to kill me. Richard smiled at the man. A wise woman told me that the people are the willing accomplices of tyranny. They make those like you possible. I'm going to do the worst possible thing I could do to you and your people. What my grandfather would have done to you. I'm going to leave you all to suffer the consequences of your own actions. Anne was so cramped, she feared she would be crippled for life, never to walk again. The box she was in was bouncing around in the wagon something awful as it rattled over cobblestones, adding to her misery. She felt as if someone had beaten her with a club. If she wasn't let out soon, she was sure she would go mad. As if in answer to the prayer, the wagon finally slowed and then stopped. Anne sagged with blessed relief. She was near tears from the pain of hitting the sides and bottom, being unable to use her hands and feet to brace herself. She heard the hasp being worked, and then the top opened, letting cool night air in. Anne took a thankful lungful, savoring it like a sweet perfume. The front of the box dropped onto the bed of the wagon. Sister Alessandra was standing there looking in. Anne peered around but didn't see anyone else. They were in a narrow side street that looked deserted for the most part. One old woman walked past, but didn't even glance their way. Anne frowned. "Alessandra, what's going on?" Sister Alessandra folded her hands in a prayerful pose.
Prelate, please. I want to return to the light.
Anne blinked. "Where are we?"
The city the Emperor has been traveling to. It's called Fairfield. I encouraged your driver to let me drive the wagon."
"Encouraged him? How?"
"With a club."
Anne's eyebrows rose. "I see."
"And then I'm so bad with directions we became separated from the rest of the line. And, well, I guess now we're lost."
"How unfortunate for us."
"I guess that leaves looking for some of Jagang's troops and surrendering, or else returning to the light."
"Alessandra, are you serious?" The woman looked ready to burst into tears. The banter was over.
"Please, Prelate, help me."
"Alessandra, you don't need me. The path to the light is through your own heart." Sister Alessandra knelt down behind the wagon as Anne still sat in her box, her hands and feet in chains.
"Please, dear Creator,"
Alessandra began. Anne listened as the woman poured her heart out. At the end, she kissed her ring finger. Anne held her breath, waiting for a bolt of lightning to strike Alessandra dead for betraying the keeper of the underworld. Nothing happened. Alessandra smiled up at Anne.
"Prelate, I can feel it. I can—"
Her words were cut off with a choking sound. Her eyes bulged. Anne scooted toward her. "Alessandra, is it Jagang? Is it Jagang in your mind?" Alessandra nodded as best she could. "Swear loyalty to Richard. Swear it in your heart. It's the only thing to keep the Dreamwalker from your mind." Falling to the ground, Sister Alessandra twitched in convulsions of pain, at the same time mumbling words Anne couldn't understand. At last, the woman went slack, panting in relief. She sat up and peered up into the wagon. "It worked! Prelate, it worked!" She put her hands to her head. "Jagang is gone from my mind!"
"Oh, praise the Creator!
Praise the Creator! How about getting these things off me and doing your praying later?" Sister Alessandra scurried to help. Before long, Anne had her shackles off and she had been healed. For the first time in what seemed ages, she could again touch her own gift. The two of them unhitched the horses and saddled them with tack from the wagon. Anne hadn't felt so joyous in years. They both wanted to get far away from the Imperial Order army. As they made their way through the city, heading north, they came across a square filling with thousands of people, all carrying candles. Anne bent over on her horse to ask one of the young women what was going on. "It's a candlelight vigil for peace," the woman said. Anne was dumbfounded. "A what?" "A candlelight vigil for peace. We are all gathering to show the soldiers coming into the city a better way, to show them the people are going to insist on peace." Anne scowled. "If I were you, I'd be heading for a hole, because these men don't believe in peace." The woman smiled in a long-suffering manner. "When they see us all gathered for peace, they will see that we are a force too powerful to overcome with anger and hatred." As the young woman marched on into the square, Anne seized Sister Alessandra's sleeve. "Let's get out of here. This is going to be a killing field."
"But, Prelate, these people are in danger. You know what the soldiers of the Order will do? The women. You know what they will do to the women. And any men who resist will be slaughtered."
Anne nodded. "I expect so, but there is nothing we can do about it. They will have peace. The dead will have peace. The living will have peace, too, as slaves." They made it past the square just in time. When the soldiers arrived, it was worse even than Anne had envisioned. Screams of panic, then terror, and then pain rose from the trapped throng. The cries of the men and the children would end relatively quickly. The screams of the older girls and women had only just begun. When at last they reached the countryside, Anne asked, I told you we had to eliminate the Sisters of the Light who wouldn't escape. Did you do as you knew I wished before you escaped with me, sister?" Sister Alessandra stared ahead as she rode. "No, brother." "Alessandra, you knew it had to be done." "I want to come back to the Creator's light. I couldn't destroy the life he created. And by not killing those few, many more could die. A Sister of the Dark would want that. How can I trust you are telling me the truth?" "Because I didn't kill this sister. If I were still a Sister of the Dark, I would have. I'm telling the truth." It would be wonderful if Alessandra had returned to the light. That had never happened before. Alessandra could be an invaluable source of information. "Or it shows you are lying and are still sworn to the Keeper." "Prelate, I helped you escape. Why won't you believe me?" Anne looked over at the woman as they rode, out toward the wilds, toward the unknown. "I can never fully believe or trust you, Alessandra. Not after the lies you have told. That is the curse of lying, sister. Once you place that crown of the liar upon your head, you can take it off again, but it leaves a stain for all time." Richard turned when he heard the horse approaching from behind. He checked Kaelin, who lay inside the carriage, as he walked beside it. She was asleep, or possibly unconscious. At least he could now recognize a little of her face. Richard looked again when the horse was closer and saw a rider in red. Kara trotted her horse up close and then dismounted. She took the reins and walked up beside him. She had a limp. "Lord Rahl, it took me a long time to catch you. Where are you going?" "Home." "Home?" "That's right, home." Kara looked up the road. "Where is home?" "Heartland. Maybe to the west in the mountains. There are some nice places there, places I've always wanted to take Kaelin." She seemed to accept this, and walked silently beside him for a time, leading her horse along behind. "Lord Rahl, what about everything else? Sahara, the Midlands, all the people." "What about them?" "Well, they will be waiting for you." "They don't need me. I quit." "Lord Rahl, how can you say such a thing?" "I have violated every wizard's rule I know. He let it go. He didn't care. "Where is Tu Shailu?" Kara asked. "I sent her home to her people. Her task with us was done." Richard glanced over. "She had her baby. A beautiful little girl. She named it Kara, after you." Kara beamed. "Then I'm glad it was not ugly. Some babies are ugly, you know." "Well, this one was beautiful." "Did it look like you, Lord Rahl?" Richard scowled at her. "No." Kara peered into the carriage. Her blonde braid slipped forward over her shoulder. "What happened to the Mother Confessor?" "I just about got her killed." Kara didn't say anything. "I heard you were captured. Are you all right?" he asked. Kara pushed her braid back over her shoulder. "They were fools. They didn't take my Aegil. When you fixed the magic, I made them all curse their mothers for ever meeting their fathers." Richard smiled. That was the Kara he knew. "And then I killed them," she added. She held out the broken top of a black bottle. It still had the gold filigree stopper. "Lord Rahl, I failed. I didn't bring you your sword, but I managed to break the black bottle from the wizard's keep with the sword, at least." She stopped, her blue eyes brimming with tears. "Lord Rahl, I'm sorry I failed. I tried my best, I swear, but I failed." Richard stopped then. He put his arms around her. "No, you didn't fail, Kara. Because you broke that bottle with the sword, we were able to get magic back to right." "Really?" He nodded as he looked her in the eye. "Really. You did right, Kara. I'm proud of you." They started walking again. "So, Lord Rahl, how far to home?" He thought it over a few minutes. "I guess Kaelin is my family, so that makes it home wherever we are. As long as I'm with Kaelin, I'm home." "Kara, it's over. You can go home now. I release you." She stopped. Richard walked on. "But I don't have a family. They are all dead." He looked back at her, standing in the road, looking as forlorn as anything he had ever seen. Richard went back, put an arm around her shoulders, and started walking with her. "We're your family, Kara, Kaelin and me. We love you. So I guess you should come home with us." That seemed to suit her.
Will there be people at this home place who need killing?
Richard smiled. I don't think so.
Then why would we want to go there?
When he only smiled, she said,
I thought you wanted to take over the world. I was looking forward to you being a tyrant. I say you should do it. The Mother Confessor would agree with me. That makes it 2 against 1. We win.
The world didn't want me. They took a vote and said no.
A vote? There was your problem.
I won't do it again. Kara limped along beside him for a time and then said,
They will all find you, you know. The Daharans are bonded to you. You are the Lord Ral. Everyone will find you.
Maybe. Maybe not.
Richard,
came a soft voice. He pulled the team up and went to the side of the carriage. Kaelin was awake. He took her hand.
Who's that?
She asked. Kara leaned in.
Just me. I had to come back. You see what kind of trouble you get into when I'm not watching over you?
Kaelin smiled a little smile. She released Richard's hand and took Kara's.
Glad you're home, Kaelin whispered. Lord Ral said I saved the magic. Can you imagine? What was I thinking? I had the chance to rid myself of magic, and instead I saved it.
Kaelin smiled again. How are you feeling? Richard asked.
Terrible. You don't look so bad, Kara told her. I've been much worse.
Richard gently stroked Kaelin's hand. You'll get better, I promise. And wizards always keep their promises.
Cold, she said.
Her teeth were beginning to chatter. Richard spotted the blanket Dalton Campbell had put on the side and pulled it closer. The sword of truth fell out. He stood staring at it.
The sword has come home too, I guess, Kara said.
I guess it has.
End of Soul of the Fire, The Sword of Truth, Book 5 by Terry Goodkind. Read by Nick Sullivan.